In the shadows of Hollywood's brightest lights lies a morgue where silence holds the city's darkest truths. From Marilyn Monroe to Robert Kennedy, one coroner stood between myth and reality, and the bodies told him everything. It begins in Los Angeles, a city that lives in the duality of dreams and nightmares. By day, it's the glittering capital of entertainment, where movie stars, moguls, and musicians weave fantasies that stretch across the globe. But by night, its darker currents surface. Behind the bright lights lies an underworld of excess, addiction, corruption, and violence. And at the crossroads of all of this, between the spectacle of celebrity and the harsh finality of mortality, stood a man whose life became as dramatic as the deaths he investigated. Thomas Noguchi. To some, he was the coroner to the stars. To others, a controversial showman who relished the spotlight a little too much. But beneath the headlines, beyond the scandals, he was also a pioneer, a man who pushed forensic science forward at a time when it was still struggling to be taken seriously. His career unfolded like a Hollywood script. Brilliance, power, scandal, downfall, and redemption. On August 5, 1962, the course of Noguchi's life changed forever. That Sunday morning, he was still a relatively unknown deputy coroner, new to Los Angeles, still carving out his place in the labyrinth of bureaucracy. His wife worried that he was gone too much, that he worked too hard for too little recognition. But Noguchi had ambition, an almost unshakable belief that he could make a name for himself in a city where names meant everything. That morning, he arrived at the Hall of Justice expecting another routine day in the autopsy room. But the note waiting for him carried a name that froze him in disbelief. Marilyn Monroe. Couldn't be. Yet when he pulled back the sheet later that day, there she was. The platinum hair, the iconic face, the woman who had captivated millions. Now reduced to silence, lying on a steel table under the fluorescent lights. Noguchi had seen hundreds of bodies by then, but this one was different. He felt something unusual, grief, a strange sympathy for a woman he had never met, yet who seemed larger than life, even in death. The examination began. He searched meticulously for needle marks, traces of injections. None. He examined her organs, collected samples, noted bruises, and prepared for toxicology results. Everything pointed to an overdose, yet something didn't sit right. The missing stomach contents. The toxicology that wasn't as thorough as it should have been. Questions lingered, and they would follow Noguchi for the rest of his career. By the next morning, Los Angeles woke to headlines. Marilyn Monroe found dead. The city was in shock. Rumors spread instantly: suicide, accident, conspiracy, murder. Was it the Kennedys? The mafia? The CIA? In reality, no autopsy could ever fully silence the doubts. And so Noguchi's name became tied to one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. But that was only the beginning. In the years ahead, his autopsy table would become a stage for some of the most famous, most tragic, and most scandalous deaths in Hollywood and beyond. Robert F. Kennedy, Natalie Wood, Sharon Tate, and the victims of the Manson family, John Belushi. Each case carried not just scientific puzzles, but political weight, media frenzy, and conspiracy theories that refuse to die even today. And through it all, Noguchi played his role with precision, drama, and sometimes a little too much flair. Reporters called his press conferences the Noguchi Show. His critics accused him of self-promotion. His supporters hailed him as a brilliant scientist unafraid to speak truth. In reality, he was both a man of science and a man who understood performance. And in Hollywood, the two were often inseparable. But before all the headlines, before the scandals and the triumphs, before the downfall that would come, there was a young Japanese immigrant who arrived in post-war America with little English, an accent he never lost, and an ambition that could not be contained. This is the story of Thomas Noguchi, the story of how a coroner became a celebrity, the story of how science, politics, race, and fame collided in the heart of Los Angeles. And it all begins on that hot summer morning in 1962 with the body of Marilyn Monroe. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Hall of Justice basement, the steel tables gleamed like mirrors, their surfaces cool and sterile. The The smell of formaldehyde hung heavy in the air, a scent that clung to the skin, the hair, the very clothes of anyone who spent enough time inside. For Thomas Noguchi, it was the smell of his new life in Los Angeles. But on this morning, as the body of Marilyn Monroe lay before him, the familiar ritual of an autopsy became something else entirely. He had handled dozens of bodies before. Men killed in car wrecks, women who had succumbed to sudden illness, victims of stabbings and shootings from the sprawl of Los Angeles crime. Each case had carried its own weight, its own tragedy. But this was different. This was a woman whose face was plastered across billboards, whose voice echoed from radios, and whose image was seared into the imagination of millions. Now she was reduced to silence, a cadaver waiting for science to speak on her behalf. Noguchi approached the examination methodically, almost reverently. With a magnifying glass, he searched for the telltale signs of injection. Faint puncture marks hidden in the crook of an elbow, the webbing of fingers, the skin behind knees. There were none. He noted the bruises on her hip, the discoloration of her skin, the absence of fresh injuries. He opened her body with the practiced incision, his voice steady as he narrated each finding into the tape recorder he had purchased himself, knowing that accuracy and accountability demanded a record. When he examined her stomach, he was struck by the absence of pill fragments. For a woman who had reportedly swallowed an overdose, the evidence didn't match. Still, the toxicology would tell more. He collected samples of blood, liver, kidneys, urine, all carefully labeled and sent to the lab. He felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. A deputy district attorney stood by, taking notes, watching every move. He could almost feel the city itself waiting beyond the morgue walls. By the following morning, Los Angeles was ablaze with rumor.
Nous papers shooted suicide, overdose, tragedy.
But whispers spread faster. The Kennedys, the Mafia, the CIA. Even before Noguchi received the toxicology report, conspiracy was already rewriting the narrative. Monroe, people insisted, was too hopeful, too full of plans, too entangled with powerful men to simply die alone in her bedroom. Noguchi's instincts told him something was off. The toxicologist's report confirmed high levels of pentobarbital and chloral hydrate in her blood and liver, fatal doses. But crucial additional tests were never performed. And worse, the samples he needed for further analysis had been destroyed. To a young coroner hungry to prove himself, it was devastating. The truth had slipped through his fingers, and with it came the gnawing suspicion that history would never forgive the gaps. He could not have known then how prophetic that fear was. Marilyn Monroe's death would become not just a case, but a legend, one that would haunt him for decades. Wherever he went, reporters asked. Conspiracy theorists speculated. Books, documentaries, whispered gossip, all of it circling back to his autopsy. And yet, as overwhelming as it was, the Monroe case also marked the beginning of his transformation. Before that August, Noguchi was a little-known deputy coroner with a heavy accent and an uncertain future. After it, he was a man whose name was forever tied to the most famous death in Hollywood. He had been thrust into the limelight whether he wanted it or not. And in time, he would learn not just to endure that limelight, but to wield it. Still, for the moment, he remained restless. The incomplete toxicology gnawed at him. The conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. His own role felt uncertain, shaky. In quiet moments, he worried he might somehow be blamed, even accused. It was irrational, he knew, but in a city built on image and perception, rationality often came second. So he threw himself into his work. Case after case, autopsy after autopsy. Victims of violence, of neglect, of chance. He studied forensic techniques, attended conferences, refined his English, memorized procedures until they were second nature. He began to believe that science, if pursued rigorously enough, could speak with a clarity the chaos of rumor could never match. And he resolved that one day, he would not be the man in the shadows, preparing bodies while others took the credit. One day, he would be the chief. But Los Angeles in the 1960s was not a city that yielded power easily. Race, politics, and image dictated who rose and who fell. Noguchi, a Japanese immigrant in a city still steeped in anti-Asian prejudice, would face battles far beyond the autopsy table. Battles not just for professional recognition, but for survival in a system that preferred him silent, invisible. The death of Marilyn Monroe had given him his first taste of what it meant to stand at the center of history. But it was only the beginning. Soon, he would be drawn into cases that exposed not just the fragility of fame, but the fractures of an entire city. From civil rights clashes in What's to the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, from Hollywood scandals to political upheaval, Noguchi would find himself repeatedly at the intersection of death and history. And every time he stepped forward, Los Angeles would ask the same question. Was Thomas Noguchi the coroner it needed? Or a man who loved the spotlight too much to be trusted with the truth? The autopsy of Marilyn Monroe had barely concluded when Thomas Noguchi began to understand the peculiar relationship between death, power, and celebrity in Los Angeles. It wasn't just about science. It was about perception. For every fact he carefully recorded, there were 10 rumors ready to drown it out. On August 6, 1962, the city awoke to headlines screaming tragedy. Newspapers carried photographs of Monroe smiling radiantly, paired with stark black type announcing her end. Crowds gathered outside her home in Brentwood, leaving flowers, weeping, staring at the house as though it might whisper secrets. Radio stations played her film soundtracks in mourning. The world wanted answers. The coroner's office, unaccustomed to such scrutiny, found itself at the center of a media firestorm. Chief Coroner Theodore Curfey, stern and unflinching, understood the stakes. Monroe's death was more than a private tragedy. It was a cultural earthquake. He made a decision that reflected both his scientific ambition and his political instincts. He would introduce something new, the psychological autopsy. Psychologists and psychiatrists interviewed Monroe's friends, associates, and doctors, piecing together her mental state in the days leading up to her death. Was she suicidal, despondent, hopeful, stable? The interviews revealed contradictions. Some said she was planning for the future. A new house, a new film role, even new love. Others described her as fragile, exhausted, dangerously reliant on pills. The psychological autopsy, instead of clarifying, created a fog of interpretation. Noguchi watched all this from the sidelines, knowing his role was critical but incomplete. His autopsy findings had been the foundation of the case, yet the missing toxicology data haunted him. He knew too well that gaps in science invited speculation, and speculation, once unleashed, could never be contained. Indeed, speculation became the story. Within days, whispers turned into bold accusations. Some insisted she had been silenced by the Kennedy brothers, her rumored lovers, to protect political ambitions. Others pointed to the mafia, claiming Monroe was collateral in a war of power. Still others suggested the CIA, the FBI, even Hollywood studio heads who feared scandal. Every theory fed the tabloids, and the tabloids fed the public. For Noguchi, the experience was transformative. He realized that in Los Angeles, the truth of a death was never just a matter of science. It was a matter of politics, of public opinion, of narrative. A coroner wasn't just a doctor of the dead. He was a reluctant storyteller, forced to stand between fact and myth. As the weeks passed, Monroe's case refused to fade. Letters poured into the coroner's office demanding explanations. Conspiracy books would follow in later years, some twisting Noguchi's words, others accusing him outright of incompetence or complicity. He was trapped in a paradox. His careful work had made him known, yet the flaws in the investigation made him vulnerable. In private, the case gnawed at him. He confessed to colleagues that he feared being implicated somehow, irrational though it was. At home, his wife Hisako worried about the toll it was taking on him. He buried himself in work, determined never again to be caught off guard. If science was not enough to silence rumor, then perhaps visibility, being the one to tell the story, was. This was the seed of the persona that would later define him. The coroner who was not afraid of cameras, who stood before microphones, who spoke to the public in a way few medical professionals dared. Noguchi was beginning to understand the theater of death. Still, in 1962 he was only a deputy, a man with ambition but little power. Los Angeles was changing rapidly around him. The city was swelling with newcomers chasing sunshine and dreams. Alongside the promise came crime, unrest, and scandal. The coroner's office was inundated with cases: overdoses, homicides, suicides, accidents. Each body told a story, and each story mattered. For Noguchi, every autopsy was a rehearsal, every press conference by his superiors a lesson. He studied not only the science but the politics, the way words could shape public perception. He knew his accent made him vulnerable in a country still rife with prejudice. He compensated with precision, with dramatic flourishes at death scenes, with the insistence that the body could not lie, but the living often did. Marilyn Monroe's death had thrust him into history, but in just a few years, he would find himself again at the center of a storm far more explosive, one that carried not just Hollywood glamour but the raw, unhealed wounds of race and justice in America. That case, the shooting of Leonard Deadwyler in 1966, would test not only Noguchi's scientific skill but his understanding of how deeply the coroner's work was entangled with the politics of the living. And once again, the eyes of Los Angeles would turn toward him, waiting to see not just what he found, but how he chose to tell it. The frenzy around Marilyn Monroe's death did not subside in the weeks that followed. If anything, it grew louder. Television crews camped outside the Hall of Justice. Reporters stalked the corridors, hoping for leaks, desperate for any detail to feed a public that demanded answers but distrusted every official word. Inside the coroner's office, the atmosphere was tense. Chief Coroner Theodore Curfey, sharp-featured and famously irritable, understood that the Monroe case had become more than an investigation. It was now a public performance, and he intended to control it. He called a press conference, not to share new forensic evidence, but to unveil his conclusion. Sitting between two psychiatrists from the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center, Curfey declared that Monroe's death was probable suicide. The room erupted in flashes of cameras, shouted questions, the rising hum of disbelief. Noguchi stood in the back, silent. He watched Curfey wave a cigar for emphasis, his voice firm as he batted away conspiracy questions. To Noguchi, it was a revelation. The coroner was not just a scientist, not just a doctor. He was also an actor on a stage, shaping public perception with every word. The science might be the foundation, but the performance was what the world remembered. That day, Noguchi saw his own possible future. If he could master the language of performance, if he could wield science and spectacle together, perhaps he could rise above the shadows of the autopsy room. Perhaps he could be the one in front of the cameras. But even as the press conference ended, he felt uneasy. The psychological autopsy, with its interviews and theories, had left more questions than answers. Why hadn't the toxicology been complete? Why were stomach contents discarded before thorough testing? Why no suicide note, no definitive proof? The conspiracy theories filled the void. Some said Monroe had been silenced because she knew too much about the Kennedys. Others claimed it was the mafia sending a message. Still others whispered about shadowy government plots, about secrets she had planned to reveal. The truth became irrelevant. What mattered was the narrative, and the narrative was out of control. For Noguchi, the experience was haunting. He replayed the autopsy in his mind, questioning every choice, every observation. Had he missed something? Could he have insisted on more tests? Could he have been braver in challenging superiors? The doubts gnawed at him. In his private reflections, he admitted to a fear that bordered on paranoia, that somehow he might be implicated, even accused, in Monroe's death. It was irrational, but it revealed something about him. He was not content to be a passive technician, his work hidden in dusty files. He wanted control over the facts, over the narrative, over his own destiny. And so, in the years after Monroe, he worked with relentless intensity. He handled routine cases with the same rigor he had given the starlet. He volunteered for more, absorbing everything he could about toxicology, pathology, and forensic science. He studied English more carefully, knowing that precision in words mattered as much as precision in scalpel cuts. Still, Monroe lingered. Each time her name appeared in print, in tabloids, in conspiracy books, in whispers at cocktail parties. Noguchi felt the tug of unfinished business. He was both proud and ashamed. Proud that he had been trusted with such a case. Ashamed that the case had slipped from science into myth. Yet out of that shame came resolve. If Los Angeles demanded a coroner who could face both science and spectacle, then Noguchi would become that man. He would not be silent, hidden in basements while others controlled the stage. He would be visible, commanding, the face of forensic truth in a city obsessed with death and celebrity. He could not have known that in just a few short years, he would stand at another autopsy table, this time over the body of a U.S. senator. He could not have known that cameras would flash as he demonstrated bullet trajectories, that his accent would echo in courtrooms and press conferences, that his name would be shouted as both hero and villain. All he knew as 1962 faded into memory was that the death of Marilyn Monroe had changed him. He was no longer just an immigrant pathologist grateful for a steady job. He was Thomas Noguchi, a man who had glimpsed the strange power of being a coroner in Hollywood. And in that glimpse, he saw not only his future, but also the dangers that came with it. The days following Marilyn Monroe's death were unlike anything the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office had ever seen. The phone lines rang constantly, journalists demanding statements, studios begging for discretion, citizens calling with wild theories. Strangers mailed letters scrawled with accusations, half-baked evidence, even biblical prophecies. Monroe's death was not merely news. It was a cultural earthquake. Noguchi, still junior in rank, kept to his duties but absorbed every detail of how the case unfolded. He watched how Quincy, the chief, handled reporters with brusque efficiency, sometimes bordering on arrogance. He observed how the board of supervisors leaned heavily on the office, desperate to avoid scandal that might splash onto their own reputations. He saw the hungry faces of journalists scribbling notes, ready to twist every word into a headline. The autopsy itself was over, but the narrative, the afterlife of Monroe's death, had just begun. For many Angelenos, Monroe was more than a movie star. She was a symbol of possibility, of reinvention, of Hollywood's promise. She had come from nothing, an abandoned child shuffled through foster homes, and built herself into an icon. Her end, then, felt like a betrayal of that promise. If Marilyn Monroe could die alone, surrounded by pills, then perhaps the dream itself was poisoned. And so people searched for alternate explanations. They could not accept that she had simply swallowed too many barbiturates. They needed something bigger, a murder, a plot, a grand conspiracy. In this way, Monroe's death became a canvas onto which America projected its anxieties. About power, about sex, about politics, about the fragility of fame. Noguchi sensed all of this, even if he could not yet articulate it. He knew that his science, careful, methodical, clinical, was already being drowned out by stories, and it bothered him deeply. He wanted the truth of the body to matter. He wanted science to stand above rumor. Yet he also realized that the public did not consume autopsy reports. They consumed headlines. That was when the idea began to take root. If he wanted science to matter, he could not remain in the shadows. He would need to step into the light. But stepping into the light was dangerous. He was a Japanese immigrant in a city still shaped by the prejudices of World War II. He had arrived in the United States in 1952, barely a decade after Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps. The word Jap was still spat casually in hospitals and offices. His accent marked him as foreign. His ambition marked him as suspect. And yet, ambition pulsed through him. He had turned down the chance to join his father's medical practice in Japan because he craved something bigger. He wanted to prove himself in America, to master the frontier of forensic science, to make a name that would be remembered. The Monroe case gave him a taste of what that might feel like. Even though Quincy had delivered the press conference, even though Noguchi's role was buried in technical notes, he knew the truth. It was his hands that had examined her, his eyes that had seen what the public would never see. In the months that followed, he noticed subtle changes. Colleagues treated him with a mix of curiosity and caution. Journalists learned his name. Even at social gatherings, when people asked what he did for a living and he told them, the inevitable next question was whispered, wide-eyed. Did you really do Marilyn's autopsy? Yes, he had. And that fact alone was enough to transform him from an obscure deputy coroner into someone brushed by the aura of celebrity. But it was not a comfortable transformation. Noguchi felt the weight of mistakes. He had allowed the toxicology to go incomplete. He had not fought harder to demand more thorough analysis. And in that gap, conspiracies flourished. Every time another article claimed Monroe had been murdered, Noguchi felt as though his own credibility were being chipped away. He vowed it would never happen again. He would learn to be bolder, more visible, more assertive. He would not let others control the story of his work. That resolve hardened as the 1960s moved forward. Los Angeles was changing rapidly, its population swelling with migrants from across the country and immigrants from around the world. The city was a mosaic of communities, Mexican Americans in East LA, African Americans in South Central, Japanese Americans rebuilding after wartime incarceration, and the glittering, wealthy enclaves of Hollywood and Beverly Hills. Beneath the sunshine, tensions simmered. Crime rose, police-community relations frayed. The civil rights movement gained force, demanding accountability in a city long ruled by an overwhelmingly white power structure. The coroner's office became busier than ever, handling deaths from accidents, overdoses, shootings, and the growing unrest. For Noguchi, every case was an opportunity to sharpen his skill. But the ghost of Monroe lingered. It was not simply a case he had performed. It was a symbol that had altered his trajectory. He had seen firsthand how the coroner's work could shape or fail to shape public understanding. And he began to imagine himself not just as a scientist, but as a kind of translator. Someone who could bridge the gap between the cold facts of death and the overheated passions of the living. In time, this ambition would make him famous. It would also make him enemies. But for now, in the early 1960s, he was still learning, still biding his time. The world had changed with Marilyn Monroe's final breath, and Thomas Noguchi quietly was preparing to change with it. The coroner's official conclusion, probable suicide, should have closed the case. On paper, it was straightforward. Marilyn Monroe, 36 years old, died of acute barbiturate poisoning. The toxicology showed lethal levels of pentobarbital and chloral hydrate. Pills had been prescribed. She had a history of depression and prior attempts. By every measure of forensic medicine at the time, the verdict was solid. But in Los Angeles, paper conclusions were rarely enough. In the weeks after Monroe's death, Los Angeles became a city of whispers. At diners and barbershops, in studio lots and law offices, speculation churned. Was it really suicide? Or had someone silenced her? Why no suicide note? Why the missing stomach contents? Why had she spoken of upcoming plans, new projects, even a hopeful future? And why, most of all, was her name so entwined with the Kennedys? The very idea that America's most glamorous starlet might have been linked romantically to the President of the United States, and perhaps to his brother, the Attorney General, was intoxicating. It fueled not only gossip but suspicion. For some, it was easier to believe in murder than in the quiet despair of a woman alone in her Brentwood bedroom. Every unanswered question became proof of conspiracy. The incomplete toxicology became, in the public imagination, a deliberate cover-up. The missing pill residue in her stomach, an anomaly explained by digestion and absorption, was reinterpreted as evidence of injection. And because Noguchi himself had meticulously searched for needle marks and found none, conspiracy theorists leapt to darker explanations. That the marks had been hidden, or that the coroner had looked away. Noguchi bristled at these accusations. He was still young in his career, still building his reputation, and yet his name was already caught in a swirl of rumor he could not control. He wanted to protest, to stand before the cameras and declare exactly what he had seen and done. But Curfew, his superior, forbade it. Only the chief coroner spoke for the office, and so Noguchi kept silent, even as his silence was filled with other people's words. At home, the strain showed. His wife, Hisako, was already weary of his long hours and single-minded devotion to work. Now she worried about the toll of Monroe's death. Not just the endless overtime, but the way her husband seemed haunted, restless, almost paranoid. He confided that he feared somehow being accused, dragged into the conspiracy. She reminded him that he had done his job with care, but he could not shake the unease. Meanwhile, the press had found a new fascination. If the coroner's office had once been invisible, a bureaucratic corner of county government, now it was suddenly glamorous, because it was tied to Hollywood's greatest tragedy. Journalists began to look more closely at how the office functioned, at who worked there, at the personalities behind the autopsies. And for the first time, Thomas Noguchi felt the strange pull of public attention. He had not sought fame, but fame, in its own macabre way, had found him. That realization was unsettling, but also thrilling. In Monroe's death, Noguchi glimpsed a paradox. That death could confer a kind of immortality, not only on the deceased but on those who handled the aftermath. The coroner, once a faceless bureaucrat, could become a figure of intrigue, even authority. If he was bold enough, if he stepped into the light, he could shape the way the public understood not only a single case but death itself. In private moments, Noguchi wrestled with the memory of Monroe herself. Her body on the steel table, the bruises on her hip, the absence of needle marks, the fragile skin that still seemed to glow under the morgue lights. He remembered how grief had struck him. Grief for a stranger, a woman he knew only through the screen yet who felt intimately familiar. It was the first time, he later admitted, that he had been emotionally shaken by an autopsy, and perhaps that, more than the science, explained why her case would haunt him. She was not just another decedent. She was Marilyn, the woman who had sung Happy Birthday to a president, who had transformed herself from Norma Jean into a goddess of the screen. To see her reduced to silence, to flesh and bone and chemical levels in a toxicology report, it pierced even his clinical armor. In the years that followed, Noguchi would perform thousands of autopsies, many of them on people whose names filled headlines. But it was Marilyn who marked him, who transformed him from an anonymous pathologist into someone who understood the strange alchemy of death and celebrity. Los Angeles, too, was transformed. Monroe's death marked the beginning of a new kind of public obsession. Death was no longer just tragedy. It was entertainment, mystery, spectacle. The city that had built its fortune on movies now discovered another lucrative drama: the true crime narrative. Every high-profile death would now be dissected not only in morgues but in tabloids, talk shows, conspiracy books, and eventually television documentaries. And standing at the intersection of it all was the coroner's office. Standing at the threshold, waiting for his moment, was Thomas Noguchi. He did not yet know it, but this was only the first act. Ahead lay assassinations, riots, scandal, political intrigue. Ahead lay his rise to become chief coroner, and his fall, spectacular and humiliating. Ahead lay cases that would define American history. But in 1962, all of that was still in the future. For now, there was only Marilyn, and the memory of her, lying silent under the morgue lights, would never leave him. In the days after Monroe's death, Noguchi found himself replaying the autopsy in his mind with an almost obsessive precision. He recalled the exact moment he had pulled back the sheet and realized it truly was her. He remembered the sudden silence in the room, the flicker of disbelief in the district attorney's eyes, the way his own hands trembled for a fraction of a second before his training took over. And he remembered the absence of a note, absence of pill residue, absence of definitive proof. In medicine, absence can be as telling as presence. But in the court of public opinion, absence only fed doubt. The public did not see his careful notes, his meticulous search for needle marks, his step-by-step narration into the tape recorder. What they saw were headlines of scandal. What they heard were whispers of politics and betrayal. What they believed was often whatever made the most dramatic story. Noguchi began to understand that truth was not self-sufficient. It had to be presented, performed, defended. Otherwise, it would be drowned out. He also understood something else, that he was operating in a city unlike any other. Los Angeles was not just a metropolis. It was a stage. The deaths of ordinary people filled his docket, but the deaths of celebrities reshaped culture. To autopsy a star was to step into history. Marilyn Monroe's death had done more than mark the end of an icon. It had revealed the hunger of the public for mystery, for conspiracy, for narrative. And it had revealed how easily the coroner's office could be dragged into that hunger. Quincy, for all his stern professionalism, seemed to relish the power of the moment. His press conference had been a performance. Cigar in hand, flanked by psychiatrists, his pronouncements carried across the nation. But Noguchi noticed something else. Quincy did not defend him. When reporters raised questions about the toxicology gaps, it was Noguchi's name that surfaced, Noguchi's work that was scrutinized. The chief had allowed the young deputy to take the fall for flaws in a system far larger than him. That lesson, bitter as it was, hardened him. He would never again allow his work to be diminished by silence. If others would not defend him, he would learn to defend himself. At the same time, Marilyn Monroe's death ignited something unexpected in him, a curiosity about the intersection of medicine and psychology. He had seen firsthand how the physical evidence of a body could never fully explain the state of mind that led to death. He had watched as psychiatrists and psychologists tried to reconstruct Monroe's final hours, piecing together fragments of interviews, interpreting her words and actions. It was imperfect, even frustrating, but it hinted at a broader way of understanding death. Not only the how, but the why. That fascination would later make Noguchi an advocate for expanding forensic science into new territories, toxicology, psychology, even public education. He believed death could teach the living, if only people were willing to look without flinching. But in 1962, as summer turned to fall, he was still just a deputy coroner, still laboring in the basement of the Hall of Justice, still answering to superiors who distrusted him. The city moved on in its way, but Monroe's shadow lingered. Each time a journalist wrote a new theory, each time a rumor spread, each time her image flickered across a television screen, Noguchi felt the tug of unfinished business. He would carry that weight for decades. Even in his old age, long after he had left the coroner's office, long after his reputation had risen and collapsed and risen again, people would still ask him, what really happened to Marilyn Monroe? And no matter how carefully he repeated the facts, no matter how firmly he stated his conclusions, the doubt always remained. It was the curse of being the last doctor to see her, not as a starlet, not as an icon, but as a body on a steel table. For Los Angeles, Monroe's death became a myth. For Noguchi, it became a crucible. He emerged from it changed, more ambitious, more determined, more aware of the strange theater in which he now played a role. He had learned that science alone could not silence rumor, and that truth alone could not stand without someone to speak it boldly. He had learned that the coroner's office, long seen as a backwater of county government, could in fact shape headlines and history. Most of all, he had learned that death in Los Angeles was never just death. It was always somehow spectacle. And as the city hurtled toward a decade of upheaval, assassinations, riots, scandals, Thomas Noguchi was preparing himself to step fully into that spectacle. What he did not yet know was that Monroe was only the beginning. Ahead lay cases that would test not only his science but his soul. Ahead lay the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, the brutality of the Watts uprising, the horror of the Manson murders, the mysterious drowning of Natalie Wood. Each case would bring him fame, enemies, and controversy. Each case would shape not only his career, but the very way Americans thought about death, celebrity, and justice. But in the quiet of that summer, as he filed away his notes and walked the long corridors of the Hall of Justice, he was still just one man. A Japanese immigrant with a heavy accent, a restless ambition, and the memory of a starlet whose final secret he had tried, and perhaps failed, to unlock. And so the story of Thomas Noguchi, the coroner to the stars, the man who became both scientist and showman, begins not in triumph but in unease. It begins with Marilyn Monroe, and with a question that will never truly be answered. Was it suicide or something else? Los Angeles, mid-1960s. Sunshine and palm trees in the postcards, but smoke and sirens in the streets. Beneath the gleaming image of California prosperity, the city was a pressure cooker. Segregated neighborhoods, limited job opportunities, a police department infamous for its heavy hand, especially in black communities. The breaking point came in August 1965, when a routine traffic stop in what spiraled into 6 days of violence. The Watts uprising left 34 dead, over 1,000 injured, and nearly 4,000 arrested. For the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, it meant an avalanche of bodies, each one requiring an autopsy, each one carrying the weight of politics. Most of the dead were black. 23 were killed by police or National Guard gunfire. Yet, when the coroner's inquests were held, 26 deaths were ruled justifiable homicide. For many in the African American community, it was confirmation of what they already knew. The system was rigged, and the coroner's office was complicit. Thomas Noguchi, still a deputy but increasingly restless for advancement, watched closely. He saw how the coroner's work, supposedly neutral, purely scientific, was in fact deeply political. A ruling of justifiable homicide closed doors. It meant no criminal charges. It meant, effectively, that the deaths did not count as crimes. To the families, it meant their loved ones had been erased by official language. It was against this backdrop that another case landed on Noguchi's table in 1966. A case that would test not only his science, but his place in the city's fraught racial landscape. The victim was a young black man named Leonard Deadwyler. He was 25 years old, a husband, a father with another child on the way. He and his wife Barbara had come to Los Angeles from Georgia, part of the great migration of African Americans who left the South searching for opportunity. But opportunity was scarce in South-Central LA, especially after Watts. Deadwyler scraped by with part-time work in construction, dreaming of stability that always seemed out of reach. On the night of May 7, 1966, Barbara, 8 months pregnant, believed she was going into labor. Leonard, panicked, tied a white handkerchief to the antenna of his car, a Southern custom signaling an emergency, and began driving fast through the streets, racing toward the hospital. His friend Gamaliel Ferguson rode in the back seat. Barbara moaned in pain beside him. To Leonard, it was an emergency. To the Los Angeles Police Department, it was a high-speed chase. Patrol cars fell in behind him as he swerved through traffic, ignoring lights and sirens. Finally, an officer named Gerald Bova, young and white, pulled alongside and stepped to the car. Moments later, Leonard slumped against his wife, a bullet in his chest. His last words to her, "She's going to have a baby." Barbara cradled him, blood soaking her dress. The officer insisted the gun had fired accidentally when the car lurched. But to Barbara, to Ferguson, and to the community, it was clear. Leonard Deadwyler had been killed for driving while black, for panicking in a city that never gave him the benefit of the doubt. The outrage was immediate. The Watts neighborhood was still scarred from the uprising less than a year earlier. Community leaders, ministers, and activists saw Deadwyler's death as a symbol of everything wrong with policing in Los Angeles. They demanded accountability. They demanded a coroner's inquest, and not just any inquest, but one that would be televised. It would be the first televised inquest in Los Angeles history. For Noguchi, it was a defining moment. He was called to the stand to testify about Deadwyler's body. He described the gunshot, the trajectory, the toxicology. He spoke with precision, his accent thick but his words careful. He demonstrated with charts and even used a bailiff's body to show where the bullet had entered and exited. But then, perhaps too candidly, he added something that changed everything. The toxicology showed Deadwyler's blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. "Very drunk," Noguchi said. The words rippled through the courtroom like an electric current. To the black community, it sounded like blame. To them, it was yet another example of shifting responsibility from the police to the victim. Whether Leonard had been drinking or not, the fact remained. He had been unarmed, driving his pregnant wife to the hospital, and shot dead in front of her. Why did it matter? Why should it excuse the bullet? Civil rights attorney Johnny Cochran, then still early in his career, represented Barbara Deadwyler. He seized on the moment, hammering home the point that the inquest itself was stacked against justice. Cochran could not cross-examine witnesses directly. He had to pass questions through the district attorney. Still, he pressed relentlessly. "Mr. Cochran wants to know," became his refrain, echoing through the courtroom and soon through the city. The jury, 7 white men, 1 white woman, and 1 black man, deliberated for hours. Their verdict: accidental homicide, no criminal charges.
No accountability.
For Barbara Deadweiler, it was devastation. For Cochran, it was a lesson in the impossibility of justice in Los Angeles. For the black community, it was proof that the system was designed to protect police, not people. And for Noguchi, it was a revelation. He had thought science would be enough, that facts could speak for themselves. But in that courtroom, broadcast live across Los Angeles, he saw how science could be twisted, how words could wound, how the coroner's testimony could shift blame. His declaration of very drunk had become more than data, it had become narrative. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the coroner's role was not only medical but political, that every word mattered, that the dead could not speak for themselves, but their stories could still be silenced or distorted by those who interpreted the evidence. The Deadweiler case scarred the city. It scarred Noguchi, too. He would never again underestimate the power of perception. And as Los Angeles hurtled toward more upheaval, toward assassinations, cult murders, celebrity overdoses, Noguchi carried with him the lessons of Marilyn Monroe and Leonard Deadweiler. That death in Los Angeles was never just death. It was always somehow a story. The funeral of Leonard Deadweiler was held on a warm spring day in Los Angeles. The jacaranda trees were in bloom, their purple flowers dusting the streets like confetti. But there was no celebration, only mourning. Over 200 people gathered for what they called a sympathy march. They walked silently behind the hearse carrying Leonard's body, moving 3 miles from Avalon Boulevard to Zion Baptist Church. Along the way, more joined in: neighbors, churchgoers, strangers who felt the injustice deeply. They paused at the very intersection where Leonard had been shot. Barbara, 8 months pregnant, walked with quiet dignity, her grief visible but her resolve steady. No words were needed. The silence spoke louder than any sermon. It said, another black man had been taken, another family shattered, another life dismissed. The march was not just about Leonard. It was about all the others who had died at the hands of police with no accountability. It was about a system that told black Angelenos their lives mattered less. It was about making sure the city could not look away. Pressure mounted on county officials. Civil rights leaders like Bishop H. Brookins demanded action. Newspapers, both mainstream and black-owned, called for transparency. The district attorney, wary of another explosion like Watts, agreed to something unprecedented. The coroner's inquest would be televised. For Los Angeles, it was a first. Cameras would capture every word, every witness, every moment of tension. The public would see how justice, or the illusion of it, was decided. When the inquest opened in May 1966, crowds surged outside the Hall of Justice downtown. People pressed against the doors, desperate to witness history. The demand was so great that the proceedings were moved across the street to a larger courtroom. Even then, it was standing room only. Sheriff's deputies tried to control the restless crowd. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The jury was impaneled. 7 white men, 1 white woman, 1 black man. The imbalance was obvious, even before testimony began. Johnny Cochran, young but already magnetic, took his place beside Barbara Deadweiler. He could not cross-examine directly. The inquest rules forbade it. Instead, he whispered questions to the district attorney, who then posed them aloud. Still, Cochran's presence was felt. "Mr. Cochran wants to know?" became a refrain, repeated again and again, until it echoed in the city like a challenge. Witnesses took the stand. A neighbor testified she believed it was cold-blooded murder. Police officers described the chase, their voices flat and rehearsed. Barbara herself testified, her voice breaking as she recounted Leonard's last words. "She's going to have a baby." The courtroom grew still, the cameras capturing every tear on her face. And then came Noguchi. He had prepared carefully. His dark suit was neatly pressed, his cufflinks aligned. He carried himself with solemnity as he took the oath. But when he began to speak, something shifted. His nervousness evaporated. Forensic science was his stage and he came alive on it. He described the gunshot wound with clinical clarity. The entry, the exit, the trajectory. He demonstrated on a bailiff's torso, showing where the bullet had traveled. He explained the toxicology results, revealing that Deadweiler's blood alcohol content was 3 times the legal limit. And then, perhaps too bluntly, he said the words that would follow him. He was very drunk. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Some gasped, others groaned. To many in the black community, it felt like an insult layered on tragedy, as if Noguchi was saying Leonard had brought this on himself. The facts of the bullet, the reality of a man shot unarmed, seemed suddenly overshadowed by the suggestion of intoxication. Cochran seized on it, pushing back through the district attorney's questions. Could the scars on Leonard's arm have been from something other than drugs? Could the alcohol level be misleading? Noguchi, ever precise, admitted the scars could have come from another cause, but he stood by the toxicology. His words, though intended as neutral science, had landed like a verdict. For the community, it was yet another betrayal. For Noguchi, it was a revelation. The truth in science did not always translate to truth in justice. After 8 days of testimony, with nearly 50 witnesses and 87 exhibits, the jury deliberated. The cameras rolled as the verdict was read. Accidental homicide. The crowd erupted in anger and despair. Barbara sat motionless, her face a mask. Outside, people shouted that there was no justice, that the city would kill them all one by one. But Los Angeles did not burn. Officials declared the televised inquest a success, proof of transparency. The LAPD walked away unscathed. Officer Bova returned to duty, and Leonard Deadweiler was buried, his name added to a growing list of the forgotten. For Johnny Cochran, the case was formative. He left convinced that the system was stacked, that change would never come from within. It set him on the path to becoming one of the most famous civil rights lawyers in America. For Noguchi, the case was equally transformative. He realized that science alone could not carry the day. Facts could be twisted, weaponized, misunderstood. His own words had shifted blame, however unintentionally. It forced him to see that the coroner's role was not only medical but political. And it deepened a conviction already planted by Marilyn Monroe's death. If he wanted the truth to be heard, he could not remain silent. He would have to speak. Clearly, publicly, even dramatically. It was the beginning of the Noguchi show. The cameras didn't just record the inquest, they amplified it. For the first time, ordinary Angelenos could watch the machinery of death investigation play out on their television screens. And what they saw was not a tidy pursuit of truth, but a fractured drama where race, law, and science collided. The black press and the white press covered 2 different realities. The Los Angeles Times focused heavily on the toxicology results, noting Leonard Deadweiler's blood alcohol content and repeating Noguchi's phrase, "very drunk." The narrative suggested recklessness. A man speeding through the city, endangering lives, provoking a tragic but understandable police response. To middle-class white readers, it was a tidy story that fit their assumptions. But in the Los Angeles Sentinel, the oldest black newspaper on the West Coast, the coverage was starkly different. Its reporters highlighted Barbara's testimony, her sobs on the stand, the image of a pregnant widow forced to recount her husband's death before a jury stacked against her. They emphasized community outrage, the chants outside the courthouse, the disbelief that an officer could approach a car with his weapon drawn during a traffic stop and walk away unpunished. For the Sentinel and its readers, Noguchi's words about alcohol were not science, they were betrayal. The divide revealed the deep fissures in Los Angeles. 2 papers, 2 audiences, 2 versions of justice. For Noguchi, the fallout was personal. One evening, after testifying, his wife Hisako answered the phone. A man's voice, low and threatening, said, "You tell the doctor if that officer is released, the doctor will be shot." Hours later, the phone rang again. Silence, then a click. Noguchi called the police, shaken. For the first time, he realized that his work in the morgue could provoke danger among the living. Yet even the threats did not deter him. If anything, they hardened his resolve. He had felt, during his testimony, a strange exhilaration. Nervous at first, He had found himself animated once he began to speak about forensics, demonstrating bullet trajectories, explaining blood alcohol levels. It was as if the courtroom had transformed into his classroom, the cameras into students. He could feel the audience hanging on his words. For a man often dismissed because of his accent, often overlooked in a white-dominated system, it was intoxicating. But he also saw the danger. One phrase, "very drunk," had carried more weight than all his careful explanations of wound trajectory and toxicology methodology. The science was precise, but the meaning people took from it was political. It was a lesson he would never forget. In Los Angeles, the coroner's voice was never neutral. As the verdict of accidental homicide echoed through the city, reactions split once again. Officials congratulated themselves. District Attorney Yvel Younger declared it fair and impartial. County supervisors breathed a sigh of relief. Los Angeles had not erupted like it had in Watts. For them, the televised inquest had worked. Transparency had calmed the storm. But in black neighborhoods, the verdict landed like a hammer. In churches and community centers, people spoke bitterly of injustice. Ministers preached that the system had failed again. On street corners, men shook their heads and muttered that justice was for white men only. A middle-aged man, leaving the courthouse, told a reporter, "Justice? There's no justice. Just you watch, they're gonna kill us all off one by one." The Deadweiler case left scars that could not be measured by coroner's reports. Barbara, widowed with 3 children and one on the way, carried her grief into obscurity. The community carried anger that simmered into the future. And Noguchi carried a new understanding of his role. He had entered the case as a pathologist. He left it as something more, a public figure whether he wanted it or not. His testimony had been broadcast into living rooms. His name had been printed in headlines. He had become, in the eyes of many, not just a doctor of the dead but an interpreter of justice, sometimes trusted, sometimes despised. In the years that followed, he would refine this role. He would become more careful with words, more deliberate in presentation, more aware of the theater of the courtroom and the camera. He would learn to embrace the spotlight, to turn press conferences into performances, to wield science as both evidence and narrative. The seeds of the Noguchi show were planted in that courtroom. But he was still not chief. He was still a deputy, ambitious but constrained, an immigrant in a system that barely tolerated him. To rise, he would have to fight, against prejudice, against politics, against colleagues who thought him unfit. The fight for the top job would be brutal. And when it came, it would propel him into the center of history once again, this time with a U.S. senator's body on his autopsy table. By the late 1960s, Thomas Noguchi was no longer just another deputy in the coroner's office. He had become a name. To some, he was the brilliant pathologist who brought precision and clarity to complex deaths. To others, he was reckless, theatrical, and uncomfortably eager for attention. What was undeniable was this: he had ambition. The chief coroner's chair was still occupied by Theodore Curfey, a gruff, cigar-smoking traditionalist who had mentored Noguchi but also kept him firmly in his place. Curfey disliked the limelight, preferred brief press statements, and had little tolerance for young men who wanted to make the morgue a stage. By 1967, however, Curfey was aging, restless, and ready to retire. The question of succession loomed. For many inside county government, the obvious choice was anyone but Noguchi. He was, after all, Japanese-born, still carrying a thick accent in a city where authority was measured in Anglo-Polish. Some supervisors openly questioned whether a man of his background could lead such a visible office. Behind closed doors, colleagues muttered that Noguchi was brilliant but too flamboyant, too unpredictable, too eager for the cameras. But Noguchi was determined. He had seen, through Marilyn and Deadweiler, how the coroner's office was no longer a bureaucratic afterthought. It was a place where science met history. He wanted to be the man guiding that evolution. His chance came with tragedy. In 1968, the nation was reeling. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April. 2 months later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy arrived in Los Angeles to campaign for the presidency. On June 5th, after a triumphant primary victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel, Kennedy walked through the kitchen pantry. There, a gunman stepped forward. Shots rang out. Chaos consumed the room. Kennedy fell, mortally wounded. His body was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, where doctors fought to save him. But the bullet had entered his brain, and the damage was catastrophic. The following morning, Robert F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. The body was brought not to Washington, not to New York, but to Los Angeles County Morgue, into the hands of Thomas Noguchi. This was not just another case. This was the brother of a slain president, a man many believed destined for the White House, a beacon of hope for millions. The weight of the autopsy was crushing. Noguchi felt it keenly. He worked with absolute precision. He mapped the wounds, traced the bullet's path, cataloged every detail. His findings were meticulous, but they raised questions that would echo for decades. The fatal shot, he concluded, had been fired from behind Kennedy's right ear, at close range. Closer, in fact, than the gunman Sirhan had been seen standing. Witnesses insisted Sirhan had never been that near. Conspiracy theories exploded. Once again, Noguchi found himself at the center of storm. But unlike Marilyn Monroe's case, this time the spotlight was international. His autopsy notes were pored over by journalists, investigators, and skeptics around the world. Every sentence was scrutinized. Every phrase could tilt public belief. For Noguchi, it was both a burden and an opportunity. The Kennedy autopsy cemented his reputation as the man who handled history's most famous deaths. It also thrust him into conflict with county supervisors, who worried that his outspokenness would embroil Los Angeles in endless controversy. But the tide had shifted. By 1969, Curfew stepped down, and despite the mutterings of his critics, despite the prejudice and suspicion, Thomas Noguchi was appointed chief coroner of Los Angeles County. It was, on paper, a triumph. The immigrant with the thick accent had risen to the top of one of the most powerful forensic offices in the United States. But triumph was only the beginning, because as chief, Noguchi would face not just corpses but politics, not just autopsies but scandals. His instincts for performance, once a strength, would sometimes betray him. His fascination with celebrity deaths would make him both beloved by the press and despised by officials. And his tenure, though brilliant, would be as volatile as the city he served. From the Watts riots to the Manson murders, from the drowning of Natalie Wood to the self-destruction of Janis Joplin, Noguchi would become inseparable from Los Angeles itself, a coroner who was as famous as the stars he autopsied. But for now, in the wake of Robert Kennedy's death, Noguchi allowed himself a moment of pride. He had risen. He had claimed the chair. The world was watching, and history once again would not let him rest. The night Robert Kennedy was shot, the Ambassador Hotel was chaos. Supporters screamed, others wept, reporters scrambled to phones, and police struggled to control the crowd. The pantry floor was littered with banners, food trays, and the blood of a senator. For Noguchi, the call came in the early hours of June 5, 1968. He was summoned to Good Samaritan Hospital, where Kennedy still clung to life. Doctors worked furiously, performing surgery, transfusing blood, fighting against the inevitable. But when the announcement came that Robert Kennedy had died, Noguchi knew what was next. The body would be his responsibility. The morgue was stark and cold, but in those hours it felt weighted with history. This was no Hollywood starlet, no troubled celebrity. This was a man who might have been president. Noguchi understood that his work would be scrutinized not just by journalists, but by the nation, by the Kennedy family, by history itself. He began the autopsy with his usual ritual. Gloves fitted, instruments laid out, assistants briefed. Yet he admitted later that his hands trembled at first. The sense of responsibility was crushing. But as always, once he began cutting, the nerves vanished. The scientists took over. The findings were exact. Kennedy had been struck by 3 bullets. One entering behind the right ear at close range, another through the right armpit, and a third grazing his shoulder. The fatal wound, the headshot, had been fired from no more than an inch or 2 away. The angle was steep, downward, suggesting the shooter had been directly behind and below Kennedy. That detail was explosive. Eyewitnesses had testified that Sirhan, the young Palestinian man apprehended at the scene, had been several feet in front of Kennedy when he fired. How, then, could he have delivered the fatal shot? Noguchi carefully documented everything, taking photographs, dictating notes into his recorder, sketching trajectories. He avoided speculation, sticking to anatomy and ballistics. But once his findings were released, speculation erupted. For those inclined to distrust the official story, Noguchi's autopsy became fuel for conspiracy. Some claimed there was a second gunman positioned behind Kennedy. Others suggested security guard Thane Eugene Caesar, who had been directly behind the senator, was the true killer. Still others believed the CIA or organized crime had orchestrated the assassination. Noguchi did not endorse any of these theories. He simply stated the facts. The fatal bullet had been fired at point-blank range, from behind. What that implied he left to others. But in the charged atmosphere of 1968, when the nation had already lost Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy, his words took on a power far beyond his intentions. Reporters hounded him. Activists quoted him. Books and articles sprouted around his findings. For a man still climbing the ladder within county government, it was both a blessing and a curse. His reputation for precision and courage grew. But so did the resentment of county supervisors, who disliked seeing one of their employees turned into a public figure. Noguchi, however, could not, and perhaps did not want to, fade into the background. He had tasted the peculiar intoxication of public attention. He was not a politician, not a performer in the Hollywood sense, but he had begun to realize that the coroner in Los Angeles was inevitably a public character. The city demanded it. Death itself was a spectacle here. When Theodore Curfey retired in 1969, the question of who would replace him became urgent. Inside the county system, there were safer candidates. Men with more seniority, smoother accents, fewer headlines attached to their names. But Noguchi was relentless. He campaigned quietly but persistently, building alliances, reminding supervisors of his expertise. He emphasized his handling of Kennedy's autopsy, his leadership during high-profile cases, his vision of a modern coroner's office. Behind the scenes, prejudice reared its head. Some supervisors openly fretted about having a Japanese-born chief. Others muttered about his showboating. Yet, in the end, Noguchi's record was undeniable. His colleagues might have called him flamboyant, but they could not call him incompetent. His autopsies had stood the test of scrutiny, even under the glare of international attention. In 1969, he was named Chief Coroner of Los Angeles County. The appointment was a milestone. No Japanese immigrant had ever risen to such a visible position in the county's hierarchy. For Noguchi, it was vindication. Proof that his talent could overcome prejudice, proof that his ambition was justified. But the victory was not unalloyed. He could sense the skepticism that lingered. He knew his enemies within the system were watching, waiting for him to stumble. And he knew that the cases coming his way would be even more dangerous, even more political, even more public than those he had faced before. His first years as chief would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. Within months, Los Angeles would be transfixed by the horrors of the Manson murders, and the coroner's office would once again be thrust into the spotlight. Noguchi had climbed to the top. Now he had to survive there. When Noguchi walked into his office as the new chief coroner of Los Angeles County in 1969, the room felt heavy with history. The walls were lined with dark wood, the desk broad and worn, the air smelling faintly of formaldehyde drifting up from the morgue below. To him, it was more than an office. It was a throne, but it was also a battleground. The coroner's office he inherited was respected but outdated. Records were still kept in cumbersome ledgers. Autopsy techniques varied from doctor to doctor with little standardization. The morgue itself, though functional, was understaffed and underfunded. Noguchi had ideas, bold ones. He envisioned a coroner's office that was not just a morgue but a forensic science laboratory of the future. He wanted better facilities, modern equipment, and a team of specialists who could bring precision to every death. He wanted the coroner's office to be not a backwater but a hub of authority. as vital to justice as the courts or the police. Almost immediately, he began making changes. He pushed for computerized record-keeping, years ahead of most county departments. He demanded more training for deputy coroners and insisted on stricter standards for autopsies. He proposed partnerships with universities, envisioning a new era where forensic science would be respected as both medicine and law. And, of course, he opened the doors to the press. Noguchi believed the coroner's office should not hide from public scrutiny. If a death captured headlines, the public deserved answers. Clear, timely, scientific. To him, it was not enough to file reports in a drawer. He wanted to explain, to show, to educate. He had learned from Marilyn Monroe, from Deadwyler, from Kennedy. Silence bred conspiracy. Transparency, even if dramatic, was better. But transparency was not the word his critics used. They called it showmanship. They accused him of chasing cameras. At press conferences, they said, Noguchi looked more like a professor giving a lecture, pointing at diagrams, explaining bullet trajectories, than a county official reading a statement. Some found it refreshing. Others found it infuriating. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors kept a wary eye on him. They liked their chief's quiet, steady, deferential. Noguchi was none of those things. He was brilliant, yes, but unpredictable. And worse, he was ambitious. To bureaucrats who valued obedience, ambition was dangerous. Still, he survived his first months in office. The city was distracted by other storms. Political protests, the rise of radical groups, the continuing aftershocks of the Watts riots. Noguchi, for the moment, had space to work. He expanded staff training. He brought in forensic anthropologists and toxicologists, specialists who could add depth to the office's work. He modernized procedures. Slowly, the coroner's office began to look less like an old morgue and more like a scientific institution. But reform was never enough to shield him. Even as he modernized the office, even as he elevated its status, whispers followed him through county corridors. He's too flamboyant. He doesn't know his place. He's making himself a celebrity. Noguchi knew the whispers were dangerous. He had seen colleagues destroyed by less. But he also knew he could not and would not change. The coroner in Los Angeles, he believed, could never be invisible. Not in a city where death was always headline news. And soon, the headlines would prove him right. Because in August of 1969, Los Angeles would wake to horror unlike anything it had ever seen before. 7 bodies, slaughtered in 2 nights. A pregnant actress, a wealthy heiress, a city gripped by fear. The Manson murders were coming. And at the center of it all, once again, would be Thomas Noguchi. The summer of 1969 was sweltering in Los Angeles, the kind of heat that clung to the city like a fever. In the canyons above Hollywood, the air carried the scent of dry chaparral and eucalyptus. The nights were restless, filled with the hum of insects and the faint glow of stars over Mulholland Drive. Beneath the surface, Los Angeles was a city split in 2, the glittering illusion of Hollywood glamour, and the rising unease of a culture spinning out of control. On the night of August 8th, that unease turned to horror. Shortly after midnight, for members of Charles Manson's cult, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian arrived at 1050 Cielo Drive, a secluded estate once rented by music producer Terry Melcher, now home to actress Sharon Tate and her husband, director Roman Polanski. Polanski was in Europe. Sharon, 8 months pregnant, was entertaining friends. What happened next would become one of the most infamous massacres in American history. By the end of the night, Sharon Tate, hairdresser Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and Polish actor Wojciech Frykowski lay dead. Stephen Parent, a teenager visiting the caretaker, had been shot in his car as the killers arrived. The word pig was scrawled on the front door in Sharon's blood. The next night, Manson sent his followers again, this time to the home of supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary. Both were slaughtered in their Los Feliz home, stabbed and carved with grotesque symbols. The city erupted in fear. Headlines screamed of ritual killings. Rumors spread of satanic cults, of drug wars, of Hollywood conspiracies. The wealthy hired private security, Ordinary families locked their doors at night for the first time. Los Angeles, a city that thrived on dreams, suddenly found itself trapped in a nightmare. And once again, the bodies came to Noguchi. When Sharon Tate's body was wheeled into the morgue, the sight was wrenching. 26 years old, 8 months pregnant, strangled by rope, stabbed repeatedly. Noguchi had seen thousands of corpses, but this one left an impression he never forgot. He worked with clinical detachment, as always, but the cruelty of the crime haunted him. He documented every wound, every mark, every thread of evidence. Sharon had been stabbed 16 times. 5 of the wounds were fatal. He noted defensive injuries, the desperate struggle of a woman fighting not only for her life but for the life of her unborn child. The baby boy inside her, just weeks from delivery, had died with her. Noguchi described the case later as one of the most tragic autopsies of his career. Jay Sebring, Noguchi found, had been shot and stabbed. Abigail Folger had been stabbed 28 times as she tried to flee into the yard. Frykowski had endured the most brutal assault, struck, stabbed, and shot. Stephen Parent, the teenager, had been shot 4 times in his car. The next night's victims were no less savaged. Leno LaBianca had been stabbed dozens of times, a carving fork left protruding from his stomach, a knife in his throat. The word war had been carved into his flesh. Rosemary had been tied, gagged, and stabbed 41 times. Noguchi's reports were clinical, but the horror within them was unmistakable. He described angles of attack, number of wounds, possible sequence of events. His autopsies painted a picture of rage and ritual, of killers who lingered over their victims with sadistic patience. To the public, the coroner's findings became fuel for the terror. Newspapers printed details that turned stomachs. The number of stab wounds, the brutality of the killings, the use of the victim's blood as writing on the walls. Each revelation made the city's paranoia worse. For Noguchi, the Manson murders were a test not just of skill but of stamina. The pressure from police and press was relentless. Detectives demanded fast answers. Journalists camped outside the coroner's office, desperate for details. Rumors swirled that Noguchi had leaked information, a charge he denied, but one that clung to him. His natural instinct to explain, to clarify, sometimes blurred the line between education and publicity. Critics muttered that he enjoyed the attention too much, but the science was unassailable. Noguchi's findings would later prove crucial at trial. His testimony about the wounds, the sequence of attacks, and the likelihood that multiple killers were involved helped prosecutors dismantle the defense's claims. The brutality documented in his reports left no room for doubt. These were not random crimes. They were deliberate, orchestrated, and ritualistic. Charles Manson himself would sit in the courtroom months later, a strange, magnetic figure with piercing eyes, and hear Noguchi's words. The coroner, soft-spoken but precise, described each wound in detail. Manson smiled at times, as if savoring the effect. But for the jury, Noguchi's testimony was devastating. When the verdicts came, guilty, death sentences for Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, Kasabian was granted immunity. Noguchi's work was one of the pillars holding the case. Yet even in victory, controversy followed. Some county officials accused him of courting too much publicity. Others questioned why the coroner's office released so many details to the press. To them, Noguchi was not behaving like a bureaucrat. He was behaving like a performer. Noguchi shrugged off the criticism. To him, the public had a right to know. The people of Los Angeles, paralyzed by fear, needed clarity. Science, he believed, should not hide in a drawer. It should confront the darkness with light. But the Manson case had changed him. The sheer savagery of the murders left a mark on his psyche. Later, when asked about the most haunting cases of his career, he named Sharon Tate first. Not because she was a celebrity, but because of the cruelty, the senselessness, the stolen life of an unborn child. For Los Angeles, the Manson murders shattered the illusion of safety in the Hollywood Hills. For Noguchi, they cemented his role as the coroner who stood at the intersection of crime, celebrity, and history. And for the Board of Supervisors, they confirmed something they had always feared. Noguchi was now as famous as the cases he investigated. The autopsies were complete, the reports filed, but the case was far from finished. In many ways, the real spectacle had only begun. The press descended like vultures. Every scrap of information that leaked from the coroner's office became headline fodder. 16 stab wounds. Defensive injuries. Baby never had a chance. Each detail, clinical in Noguchi's mind, was sensational in print. And the papers were relentless. Some reporters claimed to have inside sources at the morgue. Others speculated openly, their columns weaving fact with rumor until the truth became impossible to separate. Noguchi himself became a figure of fascination. Was he the coroner to the stars? The doctor of death? The Japanese Sherlock Holmes? Profiles appeared in magazines, portraying him alternately as a brilliant forensic pathologist and as a media opportunist. Inside the county board of supervisors, the grumbling grew louder. One aide described him as a man who doesn't know when to shut up. Another supervisor snapped, "The coroner should do his job in silence, not perform for the cameras." To them, Noguchi was undermining the dignity of the office. To Noguchi, they were clinging to a past that no longer existed. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers turned the morgue's work into evidence. Day after day, the public listened as prosecutors reconstructed the killings. And when it was Noguchi's turn to testify, he approached the stand not as a showman, but as a scientist, though the effect was no less dramatic. He described Sharon Tate's wounds with clinical detachment, his Japanese accent precise and deliberate. He explained the number of stabbings, the depth of penetration, the angles of the knife blows. He showed where the rope had cut into her neck, where her hands had struggled in vain. For the jurors, it was devastating. For the defense, it was impossible to counter. Manson's lawyers tried to suggest that the killers had been in a drug-fueled haze, incapable of intent. Noguchi's testimony cut through that fog. The wounds, he explained, were deliberate, repeated, purposeful. These were not wild swings of intoxicated assailants. These were calculated attacks. And in the gallery, Charles Manson listened with a smile. At one point, as Noguchi spoke about the unborn child who died with Sharon, Manson leaned back and whispered to one of his followers, grinning. The jurors saw it. It chilled them more than the testimony itself. When the guilty verdicts came in 1971, the prosecutors praised Noguchi's work. Without the coroner's testimony, they said, the case might have remained too chaotic, too murky. His autopsies had given the prosecution a clear scientific backbone. For the public, Noguchi's role cemented his reputation. He wasn't just the man who had handled Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy. Now he was the man who had given voice to Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, and the LaBiancas. He had spoken for the dead when the living demanded answers. But the fame was double-edged. Within weeks of the trial's conclusion, Los Angeles magazines were calling him Hollywood's celebrity coroner. Paparazzi followed him on the street. Journalists asked about his private life, his hobbies, his family. Noguchi was bemused, even flattered, but county officials were alarmed. To them, the coroner was becoming a distraction. And worse, some accused him of enjoying it. Noguchi didn't deny that he felt satisfaction in public recognition. He believed science was wasted if it stayed buried in files. To him, his role was part doctor, part teacher, part guardian of truth. If the press wanted to listen, he would speak. But every word made him more visible, and visibility in Los Angeles was a dangerous thing. It made him beloved by the public and distrusted by politicians. The Manson case was over. The killers had been sentenced to death. Their executions later commuted to life when California briefly abolished the death penalty. But the shadow of the murders lingered over the city. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Security companies boomed in business. Hollywood parties grew smaller, more guarded. And in the center of it all stood Noguchi, the coroner who had dissected the nightmare. He had handled Monroe. He had handled Kennedy. He had handled Tate. Each case made him more famous, more controversial, more entangled in the uneasy marriage of crime, celebrity, and politics that defined Los Angeles. And the deaths were far from over, because in just a few short years, Noguchi would be called upon again, not for a Hollywood actress or a political leader, but for the brightest stars of a new generation. The deaths of Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix would carry him from the hills of Los Angeles to the stages of the world, as the coroner of the rock and roll revolution. The late 1960s were a time when Los Angeles seemed to stand at the center of everything: film, fashion, politics, rebellion, music. In the clubs along the Sunset Strip, the counterculture had its stage. Whiskey a Go-Go, the Troubadour, the Roxy. Night after night, young crowds surged in, searching for new sounds, new heroes, new ways of living. And out of that world came two figures who would burn bright and die young: Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. Hendrix had been born in Seattle, raised in poverty, a shy boy who found his voice through the guitar. By the mid-1960s, he had become a phenomenon, the left-handed virtuoso who set his instrument on fire at Monterey Pop, who electrified Woodstock, who transformed rock into something cosmic. He wasn't just a musician, he was a force. His guitar seemed to channel both joy and chaos, beauty and violence. Janis Joplin was different, but no less powerful. Born in Port Arthur, Texas, she was raw energy wrapped in a raspy, soulful voice. She carried the pain of loneliness, rejection, and longing into every song. When she sang Piece of My Heart or Cry Baby, the world could feel her breaking. She wasn't polished like the pop stars of the day. She was vulnerable, wild, real, and that made her unforgettable. But both carried demons. Fame had not healed their wounds. It had magnified them. The touring, the pressure, the endless cycle of adoration and exhaustion. All of it drove them deeper into alcohol, pills, and heroin. They were young, adored, but fragile. In September 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London. He was 27 years old. Found in a flat, unresponsive, he had suffocated on his own vomit after taking sleeping pills with wine. Noguchi did not perform Hendrix's autopsy. That belonged to the British system. But the case rippled across Los Angeles, where Hendrix had often played. The city's coroner's office was asked to review reports, to consult, to explain the mechanics of such a death to the press. Once again, Noguchi's face and voice appeared in newspapers and television interviews. And then, just weeks later, the call came from West Hollywood. Janis Joplin was dead. It was October 4th, 1970. She had been staying at the Landmark Motor Hotel, a modest building on Franklin Avenue, just steps from the Hollywood Hills. That night, her band had expected her in the studio to record vocals for a new album. She never showed. A road manager went to her room, knocked, and when no answer came, pushed the door open. Janis lay crumpled beside the bed, needle marks on her arm, her lips tinged with blue. She was rushed to Noguchi's morgue. For the coroner, the case was emblematic of the times. A star cut down not by violence, but by addiction. Noguchi's autopsy revealed heroin in her system, mixed with alcohol. The purity of the heroin was unusually strong, far more potent than what she had used before. Her death, Noguchi explained, was not suicide. It was the cruel mathematics of drugs. A slightly stronger dose, a body already weakened, a moment of bad luck. The autopsy was clinical, but the grief was cultural. Janis was only 27, the same age as Hendrix. To her fans, the loss was unbearable. To Noguchi, it was a pattern he would see again and again. Young stars, lost in the very world that had elevated them. When her album Pearl was released posthumously, with songs recorded days before her death, it became a haunting echo of a life cut short. And for Noguchi, her case became another marker in the strange intersection of art and mortality that seemed to run through his career. The press, as always, turned to him. They wanted explanations, sound bites, a narrative. Why were so many young stars dying? What was happening to the music scene? Noguchi spoke cautiously, stressing the dangers of drug purity, the unpredictability of heroin. But the reporters pushed for more, asking him to connect the dots between Hendrix, Joplin, and the rising toll of counterculture casualties. Some called it the beginning of a pattern, what would later be dubbed the 27 Club. Noguchi did not use that phrase. But he did warn publicly that the deaths of Hendrix and Joplin were not isolated. The counterculture, he said, was awash in substances far more dangerous than the young realized. For a coroner, it was not prophecy. It was statistics, and statistics told him there would be more. Within a year, his words would prove grimly true. Jim Morrison, the mercurial lead singer of The Doors, would die in Paris at 27, under circumstances that remain murky to this day. His body was never autopsied, a fact Noguchi criticized. Without an autopsy, he argued, the truth could never be known. Morrison's death, like Hendrix's, would join the chorus of speculation. For Los Angeles, these cases underscored something unsettling. The very city that produced fame seemed unable to protect its brightest stars. For Noguchi, it was further proof that his office was no longer just a morgue. It was a stage where the tragedies of a generation were played out. But he also knew this. The deaths of rock stars, no matter how tragic, would never carry the political weight of Robert Kennedy or the cultural shock of Sharon Tate. They were devastating, yes, but personal to their fans, not existential to the city. The existential would come again soon, when another actress, beloved worldwide, was pulled lifeless from the Pacific Ocean. Natalie Wood's death would become one of Noguchi's most controversial autopsies. And this time, the controversy would not fade. In the weeks after Janis Joplin's death, the press spun her final hours into myth. Journalists described her as the queen of rock and roll, undone by the very lifestyle that had elevated her. Her friends spoke of her loneliness, of her longing for love and acceptance, of the irony that she died at a moment when her career was about to peak again. Noguchi's report, clinical and unsentimental, became part of that myth-making. The words, acute heroin intoxication, appeared in print across the country. The coroner had not tried to soften the reality. He didn't speak in euphemism. He explained that heroin, when mixed with alcohol, suppressed respiration. He explained that even small variations in drug strength could turn casual use into catastrophe. For parents across America, the warning landed like a thunderclap. To fans, Noguchi's voice was not just that of a doctor. It was the voice of judgment on a generation's choices. When he gave interviews, reporters leaned into the contrast. Noguchi, the immigrant scientist in his crisp suits, speaking with calm precision, became a kind of mirror for the chaos of the counterculture. Against the backdrop of long hair, acid trips, and rebellion, the coroner represented something older, steadier, and unyielding. Science, facts, truth carved into the flesh of the dead. It wasn't lost on the public. One columnist wrote, "In Los Angeles, even the coroner is famous." Another dubbed him the high priest of Hollywood's last rites. Noguchi did not invent the celebrity image, but he did not hide from it either. He attended medical conferences where reporters followed him, snapping photos. He lectured at universities, mixing technical detail with stories of the famous cases he had seen. His accent, his demeanor, his slight theatrical flair, all of it made him memorable. Inside county government, though, the discomfort grew. Supervisors muttered that he seemed to enjoy the spotlight too much. Why was the coroner giving interviews about Jimi Hendrix when the autopsy had taken place in London? Why was he discussing cultural patterns instead of sticking to his reports? To them, Noguchi was stepping outside his lane. But the public disagreed. Letters poured into newspapers praising him for honesty. Students clipped his quotes and taped them to dorm room walls. In a strange way, he had become part of the counterculture himself, the sober interpreter of its casualties. And then, as if to confirm that Noguchi had become the man to call when the young and famous died, the rumor mill turned to Jim Morrison. The summer of 1971 brought word from Paris that Morrison, frontman of The Doors, had been found dead in a bathtub. He was 27 years old, the same cursed age as Hendrix and Joplin. But unlike Joplin, there was no autopsy. French authorities listed heart failure. The body was buried quickly. Noguchi, asked by the press to comment, didn't mince words. He criticized the lack of autopsy, warning that speculation would haunt Morrison's memory forever. Without an autopsy, he said, science could not separate fact from rumor. And indeed, speculation has endured. Drugs, alcohol, asthma, even murder. The mystery remains. In the public's mind, though, the deaths of Hendrix, Joplin, and Morrison became entwined, 3 voices silenced, 3 legends gone at 27, 3 cases tied in some way to Noguchi's voice. And so the idea of the 27 Club began to take root. It wasn't a formal phrase yet, but the myth was already forming. A generation's brightest stars, all doomed to die young, all entering eternity together. For Noguchi, this pattern was not mystical. It was predictable. Fame brought pressure, pressure led to self-destruction, and drugs magnified every risk. He didn't speak in poetry. He spoke in probabilities. But the public, grieving and searching for meaning, turned the statistics into myth. By the early 1970s, Noguchi's reputation had become something paradoxical. To scientists, he was a respected forensic pathologist. To the county, he was a controversial employee who made too many headlines. To the public, he was a figure who seemed to appear at the crossroads of every tragedy that defined their times. And tragedy was far from finished. Because in November 1981, long after Joplin and Hendrix, the coroner's office would receive the body of another cultural icon, actress Natalie Wood, found floating near Santa Catalina Island. Her death would ignite questions that still echo decades later. But before that, Noguchi would face other tests. Accusations of misconduct, attempts to silence him, and the growing realization that in Los Angeles, death itself was theater, and the coroner could never escape the stage. It was the Thanksgiving weekend of 1981. Out on the dark waters near Santa Catalina Island, the Pacific was restless, waves slapping against yachts moored for the holiday. One of those yachts belonged to actor Robert Wagner and his wife, actress Natalie Wood, the star of West Side Story and Rebel Without a Cause. By dawn on November 29th, Natalie was gone. Her body was found floating face down in the water, clad in a nightgown, socks, and a red down jacket. She was 43 years old. The discovery stunned Hollywood. Natalie Wood had grown up on screen. Audiences had watched her transform from the wide-eyed child in Miracle on 34th Street into a luminous leading lady. She was beloved not just for her beauty, but for her vulnerability. And now, suddenly, she was dead. The story that emerged was murky. On board the yacht Splendor that night were Wagner, Natalie, her friend and co-star Christopher Walken, and the boat's captain, Dennis Davern. The group had been drinking heavily. There had been arguments. At some point, Natalie disappeared. Hours later, her body was recovered in the ocean, not far from an inflatable dinghy. When her body was brought into Noguchi's morgue, he knew instantly that this would not be just another case. The media frenzy was immediate. Rumors of jealousy, marital strife, and foul play spread before the autopsy had even begun. Noguchi approached the case with his usual precision. He examined her body meticulously. His findings were clear. Natalie had multiple bruises on her arms and legs, including fresh abrasions consistent with struggling. There were also bruises on her cheek. But there were no signs of strangulation, no knife wounds, no gunshot. Her lungs were heavy with water, the hallmark of drowning. In his report, Noguchi concluded that her death was most consistent with accidental drowning, possibly precipitated by attempts to board the dinghy. He suggested that she may have slipped into the water while trying to steady herself, disoriented by alcohol. He noted that her blood alcohol level was elevated, that sedatives were in her system, and that the night had been stormy. But it was not the science that the public latched onto, it was the bruises. The tabloids exploded. Was it really an accident? Or had there been a struggle? Had Wagner, jealous of Walken, lashed out? Wagner admitted that he and Natalie had argued. The captain claimed he heard shouting. The story was irresistible. A love triangle, a famous actress, a mysterious night on the water. Noguchi found himself in the middle. He tried to emphasize the evidence. Drowning, intoxication, no clear signs of homicide. But the press wanted more. They wanted certainty. They wanted scandal. And once again, critics accused Noguchi of feeding the fire. He held a press conference, describing his findings in detail. He used slides, diagrams, the same methods he always used to explain science to the public. But in this case, the effect was combustible. His remarks about the bruises, factual but striking, became headlines around the world. Inside the county offices, supervisors were furious. To them, Noguchi had once again crossed the line between science and spectacle. They accused him of turning a family tragedy into a public performance. And yet, his findings endured. For decades, Natalie Wood's death remained officially classified as an accident. But the suspicions never went away. In 2011, the case was reopened, and in 2012, the cause of death was reclassified from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. The bruises, investigators suggested, were more suspicious than once believed. By then, Noguchi was long retired, but his original autopsy report remained central to the controversy. Some praised his thoroughness, his refusal to declare homicide without evidence. Others accused him of being too cautious, too willing to avoid the political fallout of naming foul play. Natalie's death haunted him. He often listed it alongside Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy as one of the cases that defined his career. Not because of what he concluded, but because of what could never be answered. For Los Angeles, the case was the perfect storm. Celebrity, mystery, scandal. For Noguchi, it was a reminder that in his world, truth was never just science. It was perception. And perception was always political. Natalie Wood's drowning marked the beginning of the end for him as chief coroner. The board of supervisors had long considered him a problem, too visible, too independent, too famous. Her death gave them an excuse to act. And soon, the man who had handled Marilyn, Kennedy, Tate, Joplin, and now would find himself facing his own fight for survival. Not in the courtroom, but in the corridors of county power. By the early 1980s, Thomas Noguchi was more than a coroner. He was a household name. He had examined Marilyn Monroe, Robert F. Kennedy, Sharon Tate, Janis Joplin, and Natalie Wood. Each time, his work had made headlines. Each time, he had been thrust into the public eye. And each time, his scientific clarity clashed with the political machinery of Los Angeles County. Inside the Hall of Administration, the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors viewed him with suspicion. To them, Noguchi was a problem, brilliant, yes, but reckless. A man who courted reporters when he should have remained in the shadows. What made matters worse was that Noguchi was not an obedient bureaucrat. He spoke his mind. He challenged authority. He believed the coroner's office should be independent, not controlled by politicians worried about headlines. That belief made him enemies. The tension first boiled over in 1969, after Robert Kennedy's assassination. Noguchi had performed the autopsy with meticulous care, even noting evidence that suggested a second gunman. His willingness to speak openly about the case angered officials who wanted it closed quickly. The board suspended him, citing mismanagement. The public erupted in outrage. Newspapers defended him. Protesters rallied. Within weeks, Noguchi was reinstated, stronger than before. But the board never forgot. After the Manson murders, after Joplin, after Natalie Wood, the pattern repeated. Each time Noguchi spoke to the press, the supervisors cringed. Each time he gave a lecture or appeared in a magazine, they fumed. In 1982, just months after Natalie Wood's death, they struck again. Noguchi was removed from his post as chief coroner, reassigned to a research position in what was essentially a bureaucratic exile. The official reasons were vague: administrative irregularities, improper conduct. Behind closed doors, it was clear. They wanted him gone because he was uncontrollable. Noguchi fought back. He appealed the decision, demanded hearings, refused to vanish quietly. The public, once again, rallied to his side. Editorials in the Los Angeles Times and New York Times called the move political. Students at USC, where he taught, organized petitions. Doctors from around the country wrote letters in his defense. But this time, the supervisors didn't yield. Noguchi was too big, too famous, too disruptive. He was never restored to the coroner's top job. Instead, he reinvented himself. He became a professor of forensic medicine at USC, where his lectures drew standing-room-only crowds. He published books, part memoir, part medical history, that became bestsellers. He spoke around the world, teaching new generations of doctors and investigators. And in the public imagination, he was never just a professor. He remained the coroner, the man who had presided over Hollywood's most famous deaths. What fascinated people most wasn't just his science. It was his willingness to tell the truth as he saw it, even when it cost him. Marilyn Monroe? He declared her death suspicious, though officially ruled a probable suicide. Robert Kennedy? He noted evidence that contradicted the lone gunman theory. Natalie Wood? He reported the bruises, even though they fueled scandal. To politicians, this was insubordination. To the public, it was courage. Noguchi often said that his role was to speak for the dead. That meant his loyalty was to truth, not to political convenience. It was a creed that made him beloved and hated in equal measure. And yet, even as he stepped out of the coroner's office, his legacy only grew. Television shows, books, even films drew inspiration from him. The very idea of a celebrity coroner, someone who combined science with a kind of cultural theater, was his creation. But his career also raised a deeper question, one that still lingers. Can truth ever be separated from politics in a city like Los Angeles? In the end, Noguchi showed that even science, even death itself, could be politicized when fame and power were at stake. For the man once dubbed coroner to the stars, the cost of honesty had been exile, but the reward was something greater: immortality in the story of Los Angeles itself. By the mid-1980s, Thomas Noguchi no longer held the title of chief coroner. But in truth, the county supervisors had failed to silence him. Outside the walls of the morgue, his influence only grew. He became a professor at the University of Southern California, where his lectures were legendary. Students packed into auditoriums not just for the science but for the stories. Noguchi had a gift for transforming cold, clinical detail into something alive. He would describe the angle of a bullet through the brain, then pause and explain how it changed the course of history. He would show slides of autopsy findings, then tell the human story behind them, not to sensationalize but to remind students that the dead were not statistics. They were people. Forensic pathology had long been seen as a grim corner of medicine, a place for those who preferred the morgue to the clinic. Noguchi changed that. He made it vital, dramatic, essential. He showed that autopsies were not just about causes of death, but about justice, about truth, about giving a voice to those who could no longer speak. And as he lectured, his influence seeped into culture. One of the most striking examples was the television show Quincy, which debuted in 1976 while Noguchi was still coroner. The show starred Jack Klugman as a Los Angeles medical examiner who solved crimes through forensic science, often battling bureaucracy along the way. The resemblance was no accident. Klugman consulted with Noguchi, borrowing not just his science but his persona. The dramatic autopsy demonstrations, the clashes with politicians, the belief that the coroner was a champion of the voiceless. All of it came from Noguchi. Quincy became one of the most popular shows of its time. Millions of Americans, who had never given much thought to coroners or autopsies, suddenly saw them as heroic, even glamorous. The show paved the way for later generations of forensic dramas, from CSI to Bones to NCIS. All of them, in some way, owed a debt to the Japanese-born doctor who had stood under the fluorescent lights of the Los Angeles morgue and insisted that science mattered. Noguchi himself was amused by the attention. He liked Klugman, admired the way he brought a coroner's passion to television, but he also understood that Hollywood was simplifying the truth. In reality, most of his work was not about catching killers. It was about documenting, explaining, certifying. Science was rarely as neat as a TV episode. Yet Noguchi never dismissed the power of popular culture. If a show like Quincy made the public respect forensic science, he welcomed it. At the same time, he became a prolific writer. His memoirs, Coroner, 1983, and Coroner at Large, 1985, became bestsellers. They blended his personal journey with the famous cases he had handled. Readers were enthralled. For the first time, they could glimpse behind the morgue doors, guided not by rumor but by the man who had actually been there. The books cemented his reputation as the coroner to the stars, even though Noguchi himself often bristled at the phrase. For all the fame, though, Noguchi never abandoned his mission. In lecture halls and interviews, he repeated the creed that had guided him since his early days. The coroner's duty was not to the living, not to politicians, not to image, but to the dead. To speak for them. To let science cut through confusion, conspiracy, and fear. That creed had made him enemies. It had cost him his job. But it had also made him a legend. And as the years passed, his influence spread globally. He was invited to consult on cases overseas, to advise on forensic systems in other countries, to speak at international conferences. His story, a Japanese immigrant who rose to prominence in Los Angeles, reshaping the image of forensic science, inspired doctors far beyond California. Yet fame for Noguchi was always a double-edged scalpel. The same visibility that elevated his work also left him vulnerable to scrutiny, gossip, and political attack. Even as he taught and wrote, his past controversies never quite faded. The questions about Marilyn Monroe, Robert Kennedy, and Natalie Wood lingered, resurfacing whenever a new documentary or book revisited them. In a way, Noguchi became part of the very mythology he had tried to untangle. He was both scientist and character, both witness and participant in Hollywood's ongoing drama with death, and as the 1990s approached, one final chapter of his career began to take shape. Not in the autopsy room, but in the legacy he left behind. A legacy that blurred the line between medicine, justice, and popular culture. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Thomas Noguchi was no longer the county coroner. But he was still, in the public imagination, the coroner, the man whose name surfaced every time an old case returned to the spotlight. And in Los Angeles, old cases never truly died. Marilyn Monroe's death, for instance, remained a wound that refused to heal. Officially ruled a probable suicide by barbiturate overdose, the case was cloaked in suspicion from the beginning. Conspiracy theories multiplied. Was it murder? Was the CIA involved? Did the Kennedys play a role? Books, television specials, and magazine exposés recycled the rumors endlessly. Noguchi's role was peculiar. He had not performed Monroe's autopsy himself. That was his predecessor, Dr. Theodore Curfey, assisted by Deputy Coroner Dr. Thomas Noguchi, then still early in his career. But in the public's mind, Noguchi was forever linked to the case. And in his memoirs, he did not shy away from noting the peculiarities. The disappearance of her phone records, the strange delay in calling authorities, the inconsistencies in witness statements. He stopped short of declaring it murder. But he emphasized what bureaucrats preferred to ignore. The case had unanswered questions. It was a careful balance. As a scientist, Noguchi stuck to evidence. As a man who had lived through the politics of Los Angeles, he acknowledged that evidence could be hidden, mishandled, even buried. For the public, his candor gave weight to suspicions. For his critics, it was proof that he relished stirring controversy. The Robert Kennedy case haunted him even more. Noguchi had been the primary autopsy surgeon in 1968, meticulously documenting the fatal bullet that entered behind Kennedy's right ear at point-blank range. That single fact contradicted the official narrative that Sirhan, standing in front of Kennedy, fired the fatal shot. To this day, ballistic experts, historians, and lawyers debate the implications. Noguchi never claimed to solve the mystery, but he refused to soften his findings. The bullet, he said, came from behind, and that fact alone ensured the case would remain forever unsettled. His testimony in later years was cited in documentaries and books that argued for a second gunman. For some, Noguchi was the coroner who proved a conspiracy. For others, he was simply a doctor who refused to lie. And then there was Natalie Wood. Even after retirement, the questions followed him. Did the bruises on her arms and legs indicate a struggle? Did the reclassification of her death in 2012 validate his caution, or suggest he had missed something? Reporters often pressed him. His answer was always the same. He reported what he found. He did not claim more. He did not claim less. But he admitted that some cases carry shadows, and those shadows never leave. These cases defined his legacy, and Noguchi knew it. In interviews, he often reflected on the irony of his career. He had trained for science, not celebrity. He had wanted to be a doctor of truth, not a public figure. And yet, in Los Angeles, where the deaths of the famous carried as much weight as their lives, he had become both scientist and symbol. That dual identity weighed on him. In private, he spoke of feeling exiled by politics. He resented the way county supervisors had tried to silence him. But he also admitted that without fame, his message about the importance of forensic science might never have been heard. Noguchi's later years were filled with teaching, writing, and traveling. He was invited to conferences around the world. He consulted on reforms in forensic systems abroad. He spoke not only about cases but about ethics, about the duty of the coroner to remain independent, to resist political pressure, to serve only the dead. To younger doctors, he was an icon. To the press, he was still a headline. To Los Angeles, he was a paradox. The coroner who had been punished for being too visible, but whose visibility ensured his immortality. And as time passed, another transformation occurred. He became less controversial and more mythic. The battles with the board of supervisors faded from memory. What endured were the names attached to him: Monroe, Kennedy, Tate, Joplin, Wood. Names that defined Hollywood's golden age and its darkest tragedies. Noguchi himself once said, "I am not interested in death. I am interested in truth." But in Los Angeles, truth is never simple. By the 1990s, that truth was clear. Thomas Noguchi had become more than a coroner. He was part of Los Angeles's story, as much a character in its history as the stars whose deaths he examined. And his legacy would soon pass into a new era, where television crime dramas, university classrooms, and even public debates about conspiracies carried his imprint. By the 1990s, Thomas Noguchi's career as Los Angeles County's coroner was behind him, but the mark he left on the city and on American culture was just beginning to reveal itself. Forensic science, once relegated to the backrooms of hospitals and county offices, was now at the center of public fascination. And much of that shift could be traced back to Noguchi. It wasn't just that he had handled Hollywood's most infamous deaths. It was that he had explained them. He had stood before microphones and cameras, diagrams and slides in hand, and translated the language of pathology into stories the public could understand. In doing so, he transformed the coroner from a shadowy figure into a kind of public detective. Television seized on that image. Shows like Quincy, Me in the 1970s and 80s, which drew directly from Noguchi's persona, had already shown America that a coroner could be a hero. But in the 2000s, the concept exploded. CSI, Law and Order, NCIS, Bones, all of them featured forensic experts as central figures, people whose science cut through lies to reveal hidden truths. The irony was not lost on Noguchi. What had once been considered unseemly, his willingness to step into the public spotlight, was now a cultural expectation. Today, every high-profile trial seems to hinge on forensic testimony. Every major true crime documentary features pathologists and medical examiners as crucial narrators. The celebrity coroner, once scandalous, had become normal. In interviews during his later years, Noguchi often reflected on this transformation. He was proud of it. He believed forensic science belonged in the public eye. He argued that transparency was essential, that the dead had nothing to hide, and the living had everything to learn. But he also worried about the risks. The more forensics became entertainment, the more the line blurred between fact and spectacle. Crime shows compressed weeks of analysis into 30 minutes of television. Complex cases appeared to hinge on a single clue, a single test, a single revelation. The public came to expect instant forensics, what legal scholars would later call the CSI effect. Jurors began demanding DNA in every trial, even when it wasn't necessary or relevant. Noguchi understood this tension better than anyone. He had lived it decades earlier. His careful words about Monroe, Kennedy, or Wood were often spun into headlines that bore little resemblance to his intent. Now, on a larger scale, forensic science itself was subject to the same distortion. Yet even with those risks, Noguchi's impact was undeniable. Forensic pathology was no longer a hidden profession. It was part of the cultural imagination, woven into the stories Americans told about justice and truth. And Noguchi himself became a kind of archetype, the coroner as truth-teller, the doctor who stood between myth and reality. His books continued to sell. His lectures remained popular. And as true crime documentaries surged in the 1990s and beyond, Noguchi's name was invoked again and again. Producers wanted his perspective, even when he declined to appear. His cases Monroe, Kennedy, Tate, Joplin Wood became the backbone of the true crime industry. He never sought that fame, but he accepted it. In his later writings, he admitted that his own story had become entangled with Hollywood's. He had set out to speak for the dead. Instead, he became part of the living mythology that Los Angeles spins around every tragedy. And perhaps that was inevitable. In Los Angeles, even death is theater. For Noguchi, the theater of death was never about spectacle. It was about truth. Yet the paradox remained. In seeking to explain the truth, he became part of the story himself. By the time the century turned, his legacy was sealed. He was no longer just the coroner to the stars. He was the coroner who had changed how the world understood death. And as the 2000s unfolded, with cold cases reopened, DNA evidence revolutionizing the field, and true crime exploding across every medium, Noguchi's shadow loomed large. Every pathologist who stepped before a camera, every show that dramatized an autopsy, every jury that demanded forensic proof, all of it traced back in some way to the immigrant doctor who refused to stay silent in the shadows of Los Angeles politics. Long before the flashing cameras, long before the microphones at press conferences and the controversies in Los Angeles politics, Thomas Tsunotomi Noguchi was simply a boy from Japan. He was born in 1927 in Japan's Fukuoka prefecture, during a time when the nation was caught between tradition and rapid modernization. His family, like many of that generation, carried the weight of war and reconstruction. As a child, Noguchi lived through the upheavals of World War II, an experience that would leave an indelible mark on his sense of discipline and resilience. In the aftermath of the war, Japan was a country searching for stability. Noguchi turned to medicine, a field that promised both purpose and renewal. He studied hard, excelling in pathology, fascinated not only by disease but by the ultimate mystery, death itself. Unlike many of his peers, he wasn't repelled by the morgue. Instead, he was drawn to it. To him, the dead were silent teachers, revealing truths that the living often overlooked. But Noguchi was ambitious. He wanted more than a medical career confined to post-war Japan. America, with its promise of opportunity, beckoned. In the 1950s, he emigrated, carrying with him both the traditions of his homeland and the determination to make a mark in a new world. Los Angeles, with its sprawling freeways and glittering movie palaces, was unlike anything he had ever known. It was a city obsessed with life, youth, and beauty. But as Noguchi quickly realized, it was also a city defined by sudden, violent death. Accidents on freeways, overdoses in the hills, shootings in darkened alleys, and always the unique burden of celebrity, a place where even tragedy was consumed by the spotlight. As a Japanese immigrant in post-war America, Noguchi stood out. His accent, his mannerisms, his quiet but deliberate style, all of it set him apart from the buttoned-down, American-born doctors who dominated county offices. Some colleagues admired his skill and dedication. Others resented his rise. There were whispers that his flair for visibility was un-American, that his habit of speaking directly to the public was unbecoming. To Noguchi, these criticisms had a familiar sting. He knew what it meant to be seen as an outsider, but in that outsider status he found strength. He carried with him values deeply rooted in Japanese tradition: respect for precision, a sense of duty, and an almost spiritual reverence for truth. In Japanese culture, death was not merely a medical fact but a passage, an event with weight and meaning. That sensibility colored his work. Where others saw only a body, Noguchi saw a life that deserved respect, a story that deserved telling. It also shaped his philosophy as a coroner. In Japan, he had grown up with a strong sense of public duty, that those in authority must serve the greater good, even at personal cost. In Los Angeles, that meant resisting political pressure. To him, truth was not negotiable. It was absolute. That belief often clashed with the pragmatism of American politics, where compromise was the norm. But it was precisely that clash that made Noguchi both admired and vilified. In interviews later in life, Noguchi reflected on the strangeness of his journey. He had arrived in America with little more than determination and medical training, and yet, somehow, he had become enmeshed in the myths of Hollywood. He had not sought fame. In fact, he often said he was bewildered by it. And yet fame had found him, precisely because he never shied away from speaking the truth in a city that often preferred illusion. His background as a Japanese immigrant also shaped how the public perceived him. To some, he was exotic, mysterious, even theatrical. To others, he was simply the right man in the right place, an outsider who could cut through the Hollywood facade because he was not part of it. And so, his life became a bridge between cultures. Japanese precision and discipline, American openness and defiance. Between tradition and modernity. Between science and myth. The boy who once walked through post-war Japan, surrounded by ruins, had become the man who stood over the most famous bodies in America, surrounded by cameras. It was a transformation neither he nor his family could have imagined. But at the heart of it, Noguchi remained the same. A doctor who believed that the dead had stories to tell, and that his duty was to make sure those stories were heard. For all the public fascination with Thomas Noguchi, the battles that defined his career often took place not in the glare of cameras, but behind closed doors, in the tense hallways of the coroner's office, in meetings with detectives, in the guarded chambers of county supervisors. Noguchi's colleagues respected his brilliance. There was no doubt about his skill with a scalpel, his meticulous record-keeping, his ability to reconstruct a life's final moments from the smallest physical details. Young pathologists admired his passion. Many were drawn to the field because of him, eager to learn from the man who seemed to make science come alive. But admiration did not always mean affection. To some, Noguchi was too visible, too willing to speak to the press, too comfortable in the role of public figure. In a profession built on discretion, his openness struck others as arrogance. Rivalries simmered. Some deputies accused him of basking in the glow of celebrity deaths, while they handled the countless ordinary tragedies. The overdoses in dingy apartments, the car crashes on freeways, the forgotten homeless who died without headlines. Noguchi never dismissed those cases, but he understood the truth. Celebrity deaths brought visibility, and visibility brought power. If the public cared about Marilyn Monroe or Robert Kennedy, he could use that attention to elevate the role of the coroner's office. That was his strategy, but it also made him enemies. Law enforcement had a similarly conflicted relationship with him. Detectives in the LAPD and sheriff's office often relied on his expertise. His autopsy reports could make or break a case. His testimony in court was devastatingly precise, often leaving defense attorneys scrambling. But at the same time, his independence made him unpredictable. Police departments preferred coroners who confirmed their theories, not ones who raised inconvenient questions. In the Kennedy case, when Noguchi's autopsy placed the fatal shot behind Kennedy's ear, officers bristled. His findings suggested angles that didn't match their version of events. To them, Noguchi was not just a doctor, he was a liability. This tension played out again with Natalie Wood. Detectives wanted closure. An accident, a tragic but simple story. Noguchi's careful documentation of bruises and inconsistencies did not accuse anyone, but it left the door open. To the public, that door was an invitation to suspicion. To law enforcement, it was an irritant, a source of pressure they didn't want. Within county government, Noguchi was even more divisive. The board of supervisors wanted a coroner who was a manager, not a celebrity. They wanted efficiency, budget control, silence. Noguchi wanted independence, science, truth, and if truth required speaking to the press, so be it. The clash was inevitable. Colleagues recall him as polite, almost gentle in demeanor, but firm. He would not bend facts to fit politics. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply refused to alter his findings. That quiet defiance was more dangerous to the powerful than open rebellion. And yet, for all the friction, Noguchi was not alone. Many younger doctors and medical students adored him. They saw in him a model of what a pathologist could be. Not hidden, but central. Not forgotten, but essential to justice. He gave them permission to take pride in a profession long seen as grim and thankless. In law enforcement, too, some detectives admired him. They saw him as incorruptible, a man who wouldn't be swayed by pressure. For cases clouded by politics or money, Noguchi's word carried credibility. But his uncompromising style guaranteed that he was always walking a fine line. Supporters called him principled. Critics called him stubborn. Admirers called him fearless. Detractors called him reckless. Through it all, Noguchi never wavered. His guiding belief was simple. The coroner must serve the dead, not the living. The dead, he often said, have no voice. It was his job to speak for them, even if it cost him allies, even if it cost him his job. That philosophy was both his strength and his downfall. It made him the most famous coroner in the world. And it made him a target inside the very system he served. In the end, his career was a study in contradictions. Respected yet resented, admired yet undermined, celebrated by the public yet punished by his superiors. But perhaps those contradictions were inevitable in Los Angeles, a city where truth and illusion have always collided. Thomas Noguchi often said, "The dead cannot speak. It is my job to speak for them." It was more than a soundbite. For him, it was a creed. Every time he unzipped a body bag, every time he stood over a stainless steel table under the harsh morgue lights, he carried that responsibility. To some, an autopsy was a grim routine, a technical dissection to fill out a form. To Noguchi, it was storytelling. It was the reconstruction of a life's final chapter, told not in words but in wounds, not in memories but in tissue and blood. He believed that the coroner's duty went beyond determining cause and manner of death. It was about justice. A bullet trajectory wasn't just anatomy. It was a clue to whether a killing was murder, accident, or something more sinister. A cluster of bruises wasn't just pathology. It was the evidence of struggle, a final message left behind by the body itself. But Noguchi's philosophy was also shaped by something quieter, almost spiritual. Having grown up in Japan, he had absorbed a cultural reverence for the dead. In Shinto and Buddhist traditions, death is not simply an ending but a transition, one that carries weight and dignity. That respect colored his work in Los Angeles. He often insisted that the dead be treated with care. He expected his staff to handle bodies gently, to remember that they had once been people, not just cases. For him, even the anonymous dead, the homeless man found in an alley, the Jane Doe pulled from a river, deserved the same meticulous attention as Marilyn Monroe or Robert Kennedy. The dead were equal in truth. That equality, however, clashed with Los Angeles reality. The media clamored for celebrity autopsies. Politicians worried about high-profile scandals. Reporters rarely asked about the nameless victims who filled most of the morgue's cold drawers. But Noguchi never forgot them. In interviews, he often spoke about the ordinary dead, the children lost in accidents, the victims of domestic abuse, the forgotten elderly. Their stories mattered too. His philosophy also included transparency. He believed the public had a right to know. In his view, secrecy bred corruption, while openness fostered trust. That's why he often gave detailed briefings to the press, why he explained findings in plain language, why he refused to hide inconvenient truths. Critics accused him of showmanship. They said he enjoyed the spotlight, that he turned autopsies into theater. But Noguchi argued the opposite. He didn't seek attention for himself, but for the truth. If his words drew cameras, so be it, at least the truth was heard. Behind that philosophy was also a kind of defiance. Noguchi had seen how power could distort reality. Politicians wanted cases closed quickly. Detectives wanted neat answers. Hollywood wanted scandals suppressed. But the body didn't lie. The coroner's scalpel cut through politics, gossip, and rumor. In a city built on illusion, Noguchi's commitment to truth was radical. And yet, he was not without doubt. In rare moments of reflection, he admitted that the truth was not always complete. Bodies told stories, but not always the whole story.
Witnesses lied.
Records vanished. Evidence was tampered with. The coroner could reconstruct the final act, but the full script of a life and death was often unknowable. That humility, the recognition of mystery, set him apart. He was not a man who claimed to have all the answers. He was a man who insisted on honesty about the questions. Noguchi's philosophy of death was therefore both scientific and humanistic. He used medicine to reveal facts, but he framed those facts within a larger moral duty. He saw himself not just as a doctor, but as an advocate. In the courtroom, in the press, in the morgue itself, he gave the dead a voice. And perhaps that is why his work resonates so deeply even decades later. In a city where the living often rewrite their own stories with spin and image, Noguchi insisted that the dead had the final word. When people think of Thomas Noguchi, they think of Marilyn Monroe, Robert Kennedy, Natalie Wood. But for every famous case, there were hundreds, thousands of others. The lives and deaths of people who would never make headlines, but whose stories mattered just as much to him. Noguchi often emphasized that point. He disliked the idea of being called the coroner to the stars. To him, that phrase cheapened his work. It suggested that he cared more about Hollywood than about humanity. In truth, he saw no difference. Whether it was a senator, a movie star, or an anonymous John Doe, the body told a story, and that story deserved to be heard. Take, for example, the countless freeway fatalities that passed through the Los Angeles morgue. Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s was a city defined by the automobile, wide freeways, endless traffic, and, inevitably, endless crashes. Noguchi approached those cases not just as isolated tragedies, but as data. He tracked patterns. Where accidents happened most frequently, what factors contributed, how car design affected survival rates. His reports helped influence safety standards, from seatbelts to guardrails. To Noguchi, the morgue could be a laboratory for prevention, a place where lessons learned might save future lives. Then there were the victims of drug overdoses, cases that flooded the coroner's office during the height of the 1960s counterculture. While the deaths of stars like Janis Joplin or Jim Morrison drew international coverage, Noguchi handled far more cases involving young, nameless Angelenos, teenagers in Hollywood apartments, musicians who never made it big, runaways who never went home. Each overdose autopsy told a familiar story, an America experimenting with freedom, but paying the price in bodies. Noguchi's detailed documentation of toxicology trends became crucial in shaping the medical understanding of substance abuse. He also worked quietly on domestic violence cases, long before the issue gained the attention it has today. In autopsies of women who died under suspicious circumstances, he often saw signs of abuse, old fractures, repeated injuries, patterns of bruising. He testified in courtrooms, bringing scientific weight to what was often dismissed as private matters. In doing so, he gave prosecutors a tool to pursue justice in cases that might otherwise have been ignored. And then there were the nameless. Los Angeles has always been a city of transients. Immigrants, runaways, the homeless, people living on society's margins. Many of them died without identification. For Noguchi, those cases were particularly haunting. He worked tirelessly to piece together clues. A tattoo, a dental record, a fragment of clothing. Anything that could return a name to the body on the table. He often said the greatest injustice was anonymity in death. To die without recognition, without a name, was to be erased. He fought against that erasure with every tool science could provide. These lesser-known cases reveal a different side of Noguchi. They show the public servant, the reformer, the man who saw the morgue not only as a place of endings, but as a source of knowledge that could protect the living. But they also show the emotional toll of his work. Behind his measured demeanor, colleagues recall, he carried the weight of what he saw. The young lives cut short, the silent tragedies that never made the papers, the mothers who came to identify their children, the fathers who collapsed at the sight of a covered gurney. For Noguchi, those moments reinforced his creed. Speaking for the dead was not only about uncovering mystery, it was about honoring pain, about acknowledging loss, about ensuring that even the most ordinary life received dignity in death. Hollywood may have made him famous, but it was the quiet cases, the car crash victims, the overdoses, the nameless dead, that defined his deepest sense of purpose. For all the drama that swirled around his name, Thomas Noguchi never forgot that he was, first and foremost, a scientist. Beneath the headlines, he spent decades advancing forensic pathology in ways that shaped the field long after he left the coroner's office. One of his greatest contributions was in the realm of toxicology. At a time when Los Angeles was gripped by the drug epidemics of the 1960s and 70s, Noguchi recognized that standard testing methods were inadequate. Overdoses often left ambiguous evidence. Was it heroin, barbiturates, alcohol, a combination? He pushed for more sophisticated chemical analyses, demanding that the coroner's lab expand its capacity. By the 1970s, Los Angeles had one of the most advanced forensic toxicology units in the country, largely because Noguchi insisted on precision. That insistence paid dividends. His lab's ability to detect multiple substances in a single case became critical not only for celebrity overdoses like Janis Joplin's, but for the thousands of ordinary overdose deaths that flowed through the morgue. Patterns emerged, dangerous combinations, rising trends in street drugs, new threats. His reports were among the earliest warnings about the deadly risks of polydrug use. Mixing alcohol with barbiturates, opioids with stimulants, lessons that remain relevant today. Noguchi also helped pioneer studies in vehicular trauma. Los Angeles, with its sprawling freeway system, offered a grim laboratory of car accidents. By tracking injury patterns, Noguchi's office was able to document how design flaws, poorly placed steering columns, inadequate seatbelts, weak fuel tanks, contributed to fatalities. His data was cited in studies that influenced automobile safety regulations, including improvements in seatbelt requirements and crash testing standards. In this way, the morgue directly shaped public health. Another field Noguchi pushed forward was injury interpretation. He trained his deputies to look not only at what injuries existed, but what they implied about circumstances. Was a wound consistent with a fall or with being struck? Did bruising suggest restraint or natural collapse? Was a gunshot entrance wound close contact or distant? He urged his team to think like detectives, not just anatomists. That approach helped refine forensic methodology, making autopsy findings more useful in courtrooms. Equally important was his emphasis on documentation. Noguchi insisted on photographs, detailed notes, and diagrams for every case, not just the high-profile ones. At the time, this level of record-keeping was not standard practice. Today, it is considered essential. His belief was simple. Memories fade, but records endure. A case closed today might be reopened years later. Evidence must survive the passage of time. Noguchi also championed public education in forensics. His lectures and writings introduced a generation of medical students, lawyers, and journalists to the realities of death investigation. Unlike many in his field, he did not guard knowledge as if it were a secret society. He shared it. He believed that transparency was part of science, that the public had a right to understand what coroners did and why. And perhaps his most subtle but lasting innovation was the way he bridged disciplines. Noguchi saw forensic pathology not as a narrow medical specialty, but as an intersection of law, medicine, sociology, and public health. He argued that coroners were not just doctors of the dead, they were guardians of truth for the living. Their findings had ripple effects on criminal justice, on legislation, on social awareness. He expanded the vision of what a coroner could be. To the public, he was the coroner to the stars. But to science, he was a reformer, a man who modernized toxicology, who elevated record-keeping, who tied forensics to prevention, and who insisted that every autopsy was not just about solving one death, but about protecting future lives. That legacy, though less sensational than Hollywood mysteries, may be the most important of all. By the time Thomas Noguchi left the Los Angeles County Coroner's office, his reputation had long since spread beyond California. His name was known not only in American courtrooms and newsrooms, but in universities and government offices around the world. Colleagues overseas admired his unapologetic visibility. In countries where coroners and pathologists often remained faceless bureaucrats, Noguchi demonstrated how forensic medicine could shape public discourse. He was proof that the coroner's office was not merely a morgue, but a vital civic institution. He traveled widely as a lecturer. Universities in Europe, Asia, and Latin America invited him to speak on toxicology, trauma interpretation, and the role of forensic pathology in modern society. His lectures were often standing room only, not just for doctors but for lawyers, criminologists, and students from every field touched by justice. He had a gift for making science vivid. He could describe the arc of a bullet or the chemistry of a drug in terms that anyone could understand. In Japan, his homeland, Noguchi became a figure of fascination. The country had its own traditions of forensic medicine, but Noguchi represented something new. An immigrant who had risen to prominence in America, who stood at the crossroads of East and West. When he returned to lecture, he drew large crowds, bridging cultural approaches to death investigation. For young Japanese doctors, he was living proof that science could cross borders. His expertise was also sought in high-profile cases abroad. Though not always in an official capacity, his opinions were solicited on deaths that captured international attention. Reporters often reached out to him when foreign celebrities or political figures died under mysterious circumstances, eager for the insight of the man who had handled Monroe, Kennedy, and Wood. He also advised on reforms to death investigation systems. In many countries, coroners operated without the independence Noguchi championed. Political influence, corruption, or lack of resources often compromised their work. Noguchi argued forcefully that forensic pathology must be protected from political control, a lesson he had learned through bitter experience in Los Angeles. He urged governments to invest in proper laboratories, training, and safeguards to ensure impartiality. One of his most influential contributions abroad was his role in teaching. Through his professorship at the University of Southern California, he trained a generation of doctors who went on to work in forensic systems across the world. His students carried his philosophy, precision, transparency, independence, to their own countries. In this way, his impact spread far beyond his personal cases. By the 1990s and early 2000s, Noguchi was more than a retired coroner. He was a global ambassador for forensic science. He represented a vision of the profession that was both rigorous and humane, scientific and civic. And yet, he never let that prestige cloud his humility. In interviews abroad, he often emphasized that he was simply a doctor, a man who listened to the silent testimony of the dead. He told students in Tokyo, London, and Mexico City the same thing he told his staff in Los Angeles. The dead tell us the truth. Our duty is to listen. That universal creed resonated across cultures. Death, after all, is the one certainty shared by all humanity. And in that final certainty, Noguchi found common ground between nations, between traditions, between science and law. In a way, his international influence completed the arc of his life. The boy who had grown up in post-war Japan, who had crossed the Pacific with determination, who had clashed with the politics of Los Angeles, ended up as a voice for forensic truth on a global stage. He had begun his career in the shadows of the morgue. By the end, his words echoed across continents. By the time Thomas Noguchi officially retired from public service, his reputation was already carved into the cultural memory of Los Angeles. But retirement did not mean silence. Far from fading into obscurity, he used his later years to write, lecture, and reflect on what his extraordinary career had meant, both to him personally and to the broader world. His books became a key part of that effort. Coroner, published in 1983, pulled back the curtain on the morgue for the first time. It was not just a collection of cases, but a meditation on what it meant to spend a lifetime with the dead. Written in his precise, almost clinical style but infused with compassion, it became a bestseller. For many readers, it was the first time they had encountered the idea that a coroner's office was not just about grisly details, but about justice, truth, and dignity. Later works, including Coroner at Large, deepened that mission. He used his writing not to sensationalize but to educate, always returning to the principle that death investigation was a form of service to the living as much as to the dead. He sought to demystify his profession, to show that autopsies were not macabre curiosities but essential tools for fairness and safety in society. His books also gave him a chance to reclaim his own narrative. For years, others had defined him, reporters, politicians, even television producers. Through his writing, he could finally define himself. Not a celebrity coroner, not a rebel, not a headline chaser, but a doctor whose loyalty was to the truth, regardless of cost. In interviews during these years, Noguchi often reflected on fame with a mix of irony and detachment. He admitted that he had never sought it. Fame, he said, had come to him simply because of the city he worked in and the people who died there. If Marilyn Monroe had collapsed in Chicago, he would never have been a household name. But fate had placed him in Los Angeles, the city where tragedy itself became theater. He also spoke candidly about mortality. Few people spent as much time with the dead as Noguchi, and it gave him a perspective that was at once sobering and oddly liberating. Death, he said, was the ultimate equalizer. It stripped away power, wealth, celebrity. In the morgue, a movie star and a homeless man received the same examination, the same respect, the same silence. To him, that equality was one of death's most profound truths. Colleagues who visited him in later years recall a man still sharp, still curious, still teaching. Even in retirement, he mentored students, gave guest lectures, and remained a figure in demand at conferences. His stories, by then polished from decades of retelling, carried both authority and a certain gentle humor. He could hold an audience spellbound not with theatrics, but with clarity and honesty. And yet, in quieter moments, he acknowledged the toll. Decades of seeing tragedy left scars, even if he rarely showed them. He admitted that certain cases haunted him, not always the famous ones, but the quiet ones. Children lost to neglect, nameless bodies left unclaimed. These were the deaths that stayed with him, the ones he thought of long after cameras turned away. Still, he carried no bitterness. If anything, his reflections revealed a sense of peace. He had done his duty. He had spoken for the dead. He had fought, sometimes at great personal cost, to protect the independence of his profession. And he had lived long enough to see forensic science become a central pillar of modern justice, something he had always believed it should be. In those later years, as he looked back on a life that had carried him from post-war Japan to the heart of Hollywood, Noguchi understood that his story had become part of the very mythology he once sought only to interpret. He had set out to explain death. Instead, he had become part of the way society itself understands it. When Noguchi stepped away from the day-to-day demands of the Los Angeles County Coroner's office, his name did not disappear. If anything, it took on a second life, not in medical journals or county reports, but in popular culture. Television producers, novelists, and journalists all recognized the power of his story. The idea of a coroner as a central character, not a faceless technician, but a compelling figure uncovering hidden truths, was largely cemented in the public imagination because of him. Before Noguchi, coroners were background figures in police procedurals. After Noguchi, they became protagonists. Shows like Quincy, which aired in the 1970s and 80s, were directly inspired by his career. The fictional Dr. Quincy, played by Jack Klugman, was outspoken, independent, and unafraid to clash with authorities, traits pulled straight from Noguchi's real-life persona. As true crime began to surge in popularity, his name was often invoked. Documentaries on Marilyn Monroe, Robert Kennedy, and Natalie Wood frequently quoted his findings or replayed archival footage of him at press conferences. Even decades later, his voice remained part of those mysteries. Writers called him Hollywood's coroner, a man who had not only examined famous deaths but had, in a sense, become part of Hollywood lore himself. Beyond television and documentaries, his influence could be seen in the rise of forensic fascination. In the 1990s and 2000s, when series like CSI captured global audiences, the notion that science could unravel crime had become a cultural phenomenon. While Noguchi was not directly tied to those productions, the groundwork he laid, making forensic science visible, giving it a public face, showing its drama without losing its rigor, made those stories possible. He had helped bring pathology out of the shadows and into mainstream awareness. His impact also extended into literature. Many crime writers, both fiction and nonfiction, cited his cases and philosophy as inspiration. The idea that every body tells a story, that science can speak where people cannot, became a recurring theme in modern crime writing. For many readers, Noguchi was their first encounter with that truth. Meanwhile, in academia, his influence endured through his students. Generations of pathologists who had trained under him carried his lessons into courtrooms and classrooms across the world. In this sense, his cultural impact was not just in entertainment, but in the very way society learned to trust or question the science of death. Yet perhaps the most striking legacy was the way Noguchi changed public expectations. After him, the public wanted more from coroners. They wanted transparency, independence, explanation. They expected forensic evidence to play a role in solving mysteries. They understood, because of him, that an autopsy was not just a medical formality but a key to justice. Of course, this fascination had its double edge. The line between science and spectacle blurred in the decades after his career. Some critics worried that forensic science became entertainment more than evidence, that TV shows glamorized the work without reflecting its complexities. Noguchi, had he been asked, might have agreed. He never saw death as entertainment. He saw it as truth, as duty. But he also knew that if fascination with his field kept the public engaged, then it might ultimately serve the cause of justice. Even as new generations grew up never having seen him on television, his shadow lingered. To this day, when true crime documentaries recount Monroe's death, or Kennedy's assassination, or Natalie Wood's mysterious drowning, his name resurfaces. The footage shows him, calm and deliberate, explaining science to the press. The voice of the dead speaking through him once again. Thomas Noguchi had become something rare. Not just a doctor, not just a coroner, but a cultural archetype. The truth teller, the outsider who stood against power, the man who listened when no one else could. In his later years, Thomas Noguchi often spoke with a serenity that contrasted sharply with the stormy controversies of his career. The man who had once been the center of public battles over Monroe, Kennedy, and would now reflected quietly on his own journey, as though he had stepped back from the morgue's harsh lights into something more contemplative. He acknowledged that he had been shaped by both admiration and hostility. The press had made him famous. Colleagues had undermined him. Politicians had tried to silence him. Yet, in his words, truth always outlives politics. That phrase became a kind of epilogue to his life's work, a reminder that while jobs could be taken, reputations smeared, and decisions questioned, the truth carved into the human body remained unaltered. Fame, he admitted, had always been accidental. "I never chased it," he told an interviewer late in life. "It was the deaths themselves that drew the cameras." And in that, there was a trace of irony. He had never sought to become a celebrity, yet his career had been built on the bodies of celebrities. But when asked whether he regretted the notoriety, he smiled and shook his head. "It gave me a chance to teach. It gave me a chance to show the world what we do." As he grew older, his reflections turned often to dignity in death. He had seen thousands of bodies, rich, poor, famous, forgotten, and he always returned to the same truth. Death equalizes. The morgue table erased wealth, stripped away vanity, reduced even the most powerful to silence. In the end, he said, every body tells the same story, that life is fragile and time is limited. He also pondered the weight of memory. Certain cases stayed with him, not just Monroe and Kennedy, but nameless children, accident victims, the unclaimed dead. The famous give you headlines, he once reflected, but the forgotten give you sorrow. Those sorrows, he admitted, never fully left him. Colleagues and friends recall that he carried no bitterness for the controversies that forced him from office. He saw them as the price of independence. "If you do your duty honestly, you will make enemies," he said. "But the dead expect honesty. I served them first." Even in private conversations, he returned to his creed. The coroner, he insisted, must be the voice for the voiceless. That belief had never left him, even when he no longer held the office. It shaped the way he lived his final years, not with regret, but with quiet conviction that his work had mattered. And when asked about his own death, Noguchi approached it with the same calm he brought to the morgue. He did not fear it. In fact, he seemed almost at peace with its inevitability. "I have seen death every day," he told one interviewer. "It is not an enemy. It is a fact. And facts never frightened me." Those words carried a kind of poetic symmetry. The man who had spent his life insisting that truth was inviolable ended his own story by embracing death as the final truth. In the end, Thomas Noguchi left the world much as he had lived in it, as a man devoted to clarity, guided by compassion, and unwilling to bow to illusion. His body, when it finally lay on a table somewhere, would be subject to the same laws he had spent a lifetime honoring. Flesh would decay, records would remain, and truth, however it was interpreted, would outlive him. The story of Thomas Noguchi is, in many ways, the story of Los Angeles itself. A city of illusions and reinvention, of glamour and tragedy, of power and scandal. Into that stage stepped a Japanese-born immigrant doctor who believed, above all else, that truth mattered, and that the body never lies. From the moment Marilyn Monroe's body was wheeled into his morgue, Noguchi's fate was sealed. He became not just a coroner, but a character in the drama of Hollywood. With Robert Kennedy, Natalie Wood, Janis Joplin, Sharon Tate, and countless others, his role as truth-teller placed him in the center of history. Sometimes praised, sometimes vilified, he stood firm in his creed, to speak for the dead, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be for the living. And yet, to reduce him to the celebrity coroner is to miss the larger picture. His contributions went far beyond headline cases. He modernized toxicology, advanced vehicle safety through morgue research, exposed patterns of domestic violence long ignored, and set standards for documentation that shaped forensic science worldwide. He made the coroner's office not just a repository of bodies, but a source of knowledge that could save lives. His clashes with politicians and police, his very public controversies, were symptoms of something deeper. A man unwilling to compromise truth for convenience. That defiance cost him his position more than once, but it also earned him enduring respect. For in the morgue, stripped of politics and ambition, only the truth remained. Noguchi's legacy also lived in culture. He inspired fictional coroners on television, lent his name to generations of true crime documentaries, and helped usher forensic science into the mainstream imagination. Today, when viewers watch a crime drama where science cracks the case, or when they expect coroners to speak plainly to the public, they are seeing Noguchi's influence, even if they do not know his name. But perhaps his most profound legacy is philosophical. In a world that often fears death, he urged us to see it clearly. He treated the dead with dignity, insisting that every body, famous or forgotten, deserved respect. He reminded the living that mortality is the great equalizer, that death strips away illusion and leaves only fact. And he showed that those facts, if honored, could bring justice, healing, and sometimes even prevention. Thomas Noguchi died not with the fanfare that had surrounded the deaths he investigated, but with the quiet dignity he had always afforded others. And yet, his presence lingers, in courtrooms, in textbooks, in the cultural memory of Los Angeles. His voice can still be heard in archival footage. Calm, precise, unwavering. The voice of the dead, given form through him. In the end, his story is not about scandal or celebrity. It is about one man's devotion to truth. A devotion so strong that it outlived his office, his controversies, even his own mortality. The man once called the coroner to the stars was, above all else, a coroner to humanity. A doctor who believed that every life and every death deserved to be heard. And so, his story closes much as it began, with a single creed, spoken again and again throughout his life, and etched now into history. The dead cannot speak. It is my job to speak for them.